The Spearfish case begins tonight with the feel of a paper folder under your hand, its corners softened by years of handling, and the name Chester Poage resting quietly near the top of the page. Settle in and let the file open slowly. We're not here to hurry the answer, only to sit with the evidence that carried this case from uncertainty toward resolution. You can imagine the desk in front of you. If you'd like, a plain wooden surface with a small lamp, a cup gone cool beside your elbow, and a map of western South Dakota folded into uneven squares. Spearfish sits there in Lawrence County, tucked close to the Black Hills, a place of winter roads, college schedules, family houses, and ordinary errands. In the Spearfish case, those ordinary things mattered. A vehicle mattered, a bank card mattered, a few movements across state lines mattered, and one by one, as you turn the pages, the odd pieces stop looking random. The first page is quiet in the way old reports can be quiet. It doesn't raise its voice. It gives you a date, the 12th of March, 2000, and then it gives you a house in Spearfish, where Chester Poage was expected to be safe. You can almost hear the dry whisper of photocopied paper as we read that he was young, only 19, and that his life still had the unfinished shape of school, family, work, and all the ordinary plans people make without thinking they need to protect them. There's a particular stillness in a missing person file before anyone knows what kind of file it will become. You feel it in the careful wording, in the way officers write down who last saw someone, what car was missing, which phone calls were made, and what family members believed should have happened by then. The Spearfish case had that early uncertainty, the kind that makes every small object feel important, because no one yet knows which one will hold the thread. You rest your hand near the margin, and you begin with the vehicle. Chester's Chevrolet Blazer was not just transportation in the file. It became a moving marker, a shape passing through time, leaving behind traces that investigators could follow. There is something almost humble about that kind of evidence. It doesn't explain itself. It simply appears in one place, then another, while detectives do the patient work of asking who had it, when they had it, and why it was no longer where it belonged. The air around this part of the file feels cold, not dramatic, just cold in the way early spring can feel in South Dakota. You can picture wind at the edge of a parking lot, the click of a pen against a notebook, the faint smell of dust from a patrol car heater. We sit with those details because they remind us that investigations are not made from revelation alone. They are made from repeated questions, asked gently, written down carefully, and checked again when the first answer doesn't settle. Before the case became clear, it was a set of absences. Chester was absent from the places he should have been. His vehicle was absent from where it should have been. Certain belongings were absent from his family home. And as you look across those first notes, you begin to see how detectives often start not with what they know, but with what has quietly moved out of place. That is where the strange evidence begins to gather. Not strange because it glows or calls attention to itself, but strange because it is too ordinary to ignore. A bank card being used after someone disappears. Personal items turning up in the hands of people who should not have them. A route that makes less sense the more carefully you trace it. You can feel the paper map flatten under your palms as we follow it together. The Spearfish case did not wait decades in a cold case room, but it still asked for patience. It asked investigators to move slowly enough not to miss the plain things. The bank records had to be checked. The people around Chester had to be interviewed. Stories had to be compared, not with anger, but with the steady pressure of facts lying side by side. You can imagine the low murmur of an office at night, fluorescent lights above the desks, old coffee in a glass pot, and a detective reading the same statement again. When the file turns toward the bank card, the tone changes only slightly. We do not rush. We let the page breathe. A bank card is a small thing, thin plastic, easy to tuck into a wallet, easy to overlook until it begins making a record of its own. In the Spearfish case, that kind of record mattered because machines remember in a very particular way. They remember time, they remember place, they remember a withdrawal when a person cannot speak for himself. You can hear the soft mechanical sound of an ATM receipt being printed, though we are only imagining it from the paperwork. The ink would have been faintly shiny at first, then dull as it dried. The numbers, written in the report, would have placed someone somewhere at a particular moment. For detectives, that can be a quiet kind of anchor. It doesn't solve the whole sea. It simply gives you one fixed point. We pause there because fixed points are precious in a case like this. A witness may remember imperfectly. A frightened person may change a story. A rumor may travel faster than the truth. But a financial record, handled carefully and interpreted correctly, can sit in the file with a steadier voice. You look at it, and you ask the same calm question every investigator asks. Who used this, and what did that use reveal? The answer did not arrive all at once. It came through comparison. You compare the missing vehicle with the missing card. You compare the timing with the people who had last been near Chester. You compare property taken from the home with later attempts to sell or move it. Patient detective work often feels less like chasing and more like aligning. You bring one thin sheet over another, hold them toward the lamp, and watch the marks begin to match. There is also the human side of that waiting. Chester's family was not looking at an abstract puzzle. They were waiting for someone they loved. That fact belongs in every paragraph of the case, even when we're discussing bank records and vehicles and interviews. You can let your eyes rest for a moment on the name Chester Poage, because behind every item in the Spearfish case was a person whose absence changed the room around him. Across the next pages, the investigation begins to move beyond Spearfish, and we move with it gently, following the trail not as a chase, but as a careful reading of where the evidence went. The route out of South Dakota is one of those parts of the file where geography starts to carry meaning. You see place names appear, Rapid City, then farther roads, then the suggestion of travel beyond the familiar outline of the Black Hills. The paper feels wider here. The case stretches. You can imagine a highway at night, not as a scene of drama, but as a long ribbon of dark pavement. Headlights washing over signs, the heater blowing dry air against the windshield. In the Spearfish case, movement became evidence because movement can be tested. A person says they were here. A receipt places them there. A vehicle is seen or recovered somewhere else. The patient work is in the measuring. You don't have to raise your voice to notice that one account does not fit another. You simply set the accounts down on the desk and let them show their shape. There is something almost archival about this part of the investigation. Even though the events were fresh then, you and I are reading them now as old documents, and the age gives them a different texture. The pages feel dry. The staples catch slightly when you lift them. The typed lines hold names, dates, statements, and the quiet pressure of decisions made by people who may not have understood how many traces they were leaving behind. Those traces included objects. In many solved cases, the most important evidence is not dramatic at all. It is a stereo system, a piece of clothing, an item missing from a home, a possession that passes from one hand to another and asks to be explained. In the Spearfish case, property connected to Chester helped investigators see that this was not simply a disappearance. It was a pattern of use, removal, and movement after he was gone. You can imagine the evidence room where such things might be logged. The air is cooler there. The shelves smell faintly of cardboard, plastic bags, metal cabinets, and paper labels. Someone writes an item number. Someone seals a bag. Someone checks the spelling of a name because small mistakes can matter later. This is the patient side of police work, the side with forms and signatures, where care is measured in details no one applauds. The word weird in a case like this does not mean theatrical. It means out of place. It means a bank card acting as though life had continued normally when it had not. It means personal property appearing in the wrong context. It means travel that doesn't match the calm, expected pattern of a young man's week. As you sit with the file, you start to feel how the oddness is not loud, it is persistent. Detectives would have had to speak with people who knew Chester, and with people who knew the men who had been around him. Interviews are their own kind of evidence, soft at first, then firmer when compared against records. You can picture a small interview room, a table with a worn edge, the scratch of a chair leg, the faint hum of a vent overhead. In that room, patience can matter more than force. Silence can be useful. Repetition can be useful. A question asked the same way twice can reveal a change. We keep the focus gentle here because the case itself contains enough sorrow without adding weight to it. The important thing for our purpose tonight is how the truth came into view. It came through people being located, statements being taken, physical items being traced, and the timeline growing less cloudy. It came through the old discipline of not trusting one clue alone, but asking whether several modest clues were all pointing in the same direction. The Spearfish case began to narrow around 3 men who had been connected to Chester near the time he disappeared. Their names would become part of the court record: Elijah Page, Briley Piper, and Darrell Hoadley. For now, as we read this portion of the file, we keep our tone level. Names in a case file are not decorations. They are responsibilities. Each one must be handled with exactness. You may notice how the file changes once investigators had names, travel, possessions, and financial records moving in the same direction. The pages no longer feel like scattered leaves. They begin to feel stacked. A card use supports a timeline. A recovered item supports a statement. A statement leads to another question. The work is still careful, but the fog has edges now. Years later, people might remember the case by its outcome, but inside the investigation, the outcome had to be built slowly, and the next pages ask us to sit with the interviews that turn scattered evidence into a clearer account. An interview transcript has its own strange quiet. You can see the names at the left margin, the answers laid out in plain language, the pauses flattened into punctuation. If you hold the page in your mind, you might feel the slight tackiness of toner under your thumb, or hear the small click of a recorder being placed on the table. In the Spearfish case, interviews mattered because the physical evidence had already begun to limit what could reasonably be said. This is one of the calm lessons of patient detective work. Evidence does not always speak first, but it often waits beside the conversation. A person may offer a version of events. Then the bank record sits there. The missing property sits there. The vehicle's movement sits there. You, as the detective at the lamp-lit desk tonight, don't need to force the page to confess anything. You only need to notice what can and cannot fit. The statements that followed helped investigators understand what had happened to Chester Poage and who was responsible. We do not need to linger on the harmful details. This channel of thought is gentler than that. What matters here is the method, the way a case moved from uncertainty into accountability, because the evidence, the interviews, and the recovered property were brought together with care. You can almost feel the emotional weight in the room where a family is told that investigators now know more. There is no easy version of that conversation. Even in a solved case, the answer can be heavy. A solved case does not restore what was lost. It only names what happened, and sometimes naming is the only form of order the world is able to offer. The Spearfish case was resolved through arrests, confessions, court proceedings, and convictions, but none of those words should be made sharper than they need to be tonight. We let them rest plainly, Elijah Page, Briley Piper, and Darrell Hoadley were all convicted in connection with Chester's death. The legal process continued for years after the investigation, with sentences, appeals, and the long machinery of the courts moving at its own slow pace. There is a different kind of patience in court records. The paper changes. Police reports give way to motions, opinions, sentencing documents, and appellate language. The rooms change too. Instead of an evidence room, you might picture polished benches, microphones, folders arranged by counsel, and the dry rustle of people standing when a judge enters. The air feels formal, cooler somehow, and every word is expected to carry weight. As we sit with that later part of the Spearfish case, we can notice how an investigation does not truly end when the first answer appears. It has to survive review. It has to be written in a way that others can understand. It has to move from the street to the station, to the courtroom, to the record. That movement is slow and sometimes difficult, but it is part of how a community tries to make truth durable. The weird evidence, then, was not one magical object. It was a cluster of ordinary objects behaving in extraordinary ways. A card, a vehicle, property, travel, statements that had to stand beside those facts. Each piece was modest by itself, but together they formed a path through the darkened room of not knowing. You might turn the page now and notice your own breathing has slowed. That is all right. The file will wait. The Spearfish case has waited in records for many years, and nothing in it requires hurry from us tonight. We can keep moving softly, one paragraph at a time, with the lamp still warm and the old paper open beneath your hand. You can let the next page settle before you read it, because the Spearfish case asks for that kind of pace, the kind where a detail is allowed to become clear in its own time. The paper here feels heavier, as though the ordinary objects in the file have absorbed more meaning than they ever wanted. You see the Chevrolet Blazer again, you see the bank card again, and you see how movement kept leaving little marks behind. We follow those marks softly, not because they are dramatic, but because they are patient. A vehicle can become a witness in its own quiet way. It has places it was seen, people who rode inside it, fuel it needed, and roads it could not have traveled without someone choosing the direction. In the Spearfish case, Chester's Blazer carried more than one question across the map, and as you sit with the report, you begin to understand why investigators kept returning to it. You can almost smell the old upholstery, cold vinyl, dust in the floor mats, and the faint metallic scent that clings to a key turned many times. The important thing is not simply that the Blazer moved, it is that it moved while Chester did not return to explain it. You place that thought beside the bank card, and beside the property, and beside the statements that came later, and the file begins to take on a steady rhythm. We are watching a timeline being built from small confirmations. One line gives a date, another line gives a place, a third line gives a name, and slowly the blank space grows smaller. You might imagine the investigators with road maps spread open, the folds whitening along the creases as they check distance against memory. A route that takes an hour on paper can feel longer in winter light, especially when the road passes through open country, where the wind has room to lean against the car. The Spearfish case had that wide western feeling around it, a feeling of towns connected by long roads and quiet intervals. In such places a vehicle is not background. It is part of the story's measure. When you work through this kind of file, you begin to notice how practical everything is. Detectives ask who had access to the house. They ask who knew Chester. They ask who might have used his card, who might have driven his vehicle, and who might have handled his belongings after the 12th of March. Nothing in those questions needs a raised voice. The pressure comes from the calm repetition, from asking again after the record has been checked. The bank card carries us to another kind of evidence, one that feels almost modern even now. though the case itself has aged into history. Machines leave receipts. They store transaction times. They preserve numbers that do not know they may later become important. In the Spearfish case, that quiet machinery helped investigators test what people said against what the records already knew. You can feel the contrast: warm human memory on one side, cool printed data on the other. A withdrawal after a disappearance can become a small, hard shape in the file. You don't have to make it larger than it is. You only have to set it down and ask how it belongs. Who had the card? Who knew the number? Who stood in front of the machine and asked it for money? The questions are simple, but in a patient investigation, simple questions often do the deepest work. We can picture the ATM itself in a wash of artificial light, a square of glass, metal, and plastic set into a wall, or standing in a quiet place where people come and go without remembering each other. There may have been tire grit near the curb, a bank lobby smell, cold air at the doorway, the soft beep of buttons beneath a finger. The machine did not understand the sorrow around the Spearfish case. It simply kept its record. That record mattered because it gave investigators something outside the shifting human room. A person can be afraid. A person can misremember. A person can try to make a story smaller or more convenient. But the transaction was not trying to protect itself. It had no reason to soften the edges. As you read it tonight, you can let it sit there plainly, one of the odd, durable pieces that helped solve the case. There is a quiet discipline in not asking one piece of evidence to do too much. We do not say the bank card solved everything by itself, because that would make the work smaller than it was. We say instead that it helped, and that it helped because it connected people, time, and movement. In the Spearfish case, the strength came from the way several strange, ordinary things lean toward the same answer. You notice the pattern, and you turn the page. The next section has the feel of inventory. Items taken from Chester's house. Items later discussed in interviews. Items that changed hands, or were found, or became part of the explanation investigators were building. You can almost hear a cardboard box being set on a metal table, the low scrape of it, the small flap bending back as someone checks a label. These details may seem dry, but they are where the truth often waits. Property evidence can feel intimate in a way financial records do not. A card is a tool, but a person's belongings carry traces of daily life. They have fingerprints of habit, not always literal fingerprints, but the familiar pattern of what someone chose, kept, used, or valued. In the Spearfish case, the belongings connected to Chester were reminders that the file was never only about a legal question. It was also about a home disturbed, a family waiting, and a life interrupted before it had reached its full shape. You can pause over that, without making the room heavier than it needs to be. The lamp still glows. The paper still waits. We keep our attention on the patient work because patient work is how the people in the file tried to answer the silence. Every item had to be described, handled, compared, and placed into the chain of events. A stereo, a card, a vehicle, a personal possession, each one held a small portion of the larger answer. When investigators follow property, they often follow behavior. Someone has to decide what to keep, sell, hide, move, or explain. Those decisions leave a pattern, even when the pattern is messy. In the Spearfish case, that pattern helped turn vague suspicion into a clearer account. You can see why detectives would return to those objects again and again, because an object in the wrong hands quietly asks for a reason. The texture of this part of the file is different from the interviews. It is more physical. You might feel the plastic of an evidence bag, smooth and slightly cloudy. You might smell permanent marker on a label, sharp for a moment, then fading into paper and dust. You might hear the click of a camera documenting an item on a plain table. None of it is glamorous. That is why it feels true. As we move through the Spearfish case, you begin to see the importance of accumulation. One odd thing can be explained away. Two odd things make the mind linger. 3, 4, and 5 odd things begin to press gently against the edge of coincidence. We are not forcing a conclusion. We are allowing the evidence to gather, like papers arranged in a careful stack. By the time the stack is high enough, the answer has less room to hide. The interviews became more meaningful because of that stack. A question about the blazer was no longer only a question about a vehicle. It was also a question about the bank card, the property, the route, and the company Chester had kept. You can imagine an investigator speaking evenly, making notes without hurry, letting each answer settle before the next question arrives. The room may have smelled of coffee, winter coats, and the faint dryness of office carpet warmed all day by overhead lights. In the Spearfish case, the men eventually connected to the crime were not faraway strangers from a detective novel. They were people whose names entered the record through proximity, statements, possession, and the patient comparing of facts. Elijah Page, Briley Piper, and Darrell Hoadley became central to the case as investigators brought the pieces together. We say their names calmly because the record requires calm. A name in an old file should be spoken with accuracy, not heat. You may notice how much of detective work depends on the unromantic act of checking. Check a story against a time. Check a time against a receipt. Check a receipt against travel. Check travel against a vehicle. Check the vehicle against what witnesses saw, and then check the witnesses against each other. The work can feel repetitive, but repetition is one of the ways truth is protected from impatience. There is a reason old detectives sometimes keep notebooks long after a case has moved to court. A notebook holds the order in which things were learned, and that order can matter. It tells you what was known before a confession, before an arrest, before a theory hardened into a charge. In the Spearfish case, the order mattered because investigators were moving from uncertainty toward proof. You can almost feel the small ridge of a spiral notebook beneath your palm as we sit with that idea. The human mind wants a clean line through a mystery. It wants to say, this clue led to that answer, and then everything was plain. But cases rarely behave with that kind of neatness. They are made from interruptions, corrections, partial memories, phone calls, forms, delays, and long hours when nothing seems to change. The Spearfish case was solved because people stayed with those ordinary frustrations long enough for the pattern to hold. You turn another page, and the sound is soft. This section brings us back to statements, where evidence and memory begin to meet. The transcript may not preserve the temperature of the room, or the expression on a face, or the length of a pause before an answer, but you can sense those things around the edges. The page gives only words. The people in the room had to live with the weight of them. A statement is not just an account, it is also a test of what the speaker can bear to say. In the Spearfish case, statements helped bring forward the reality behind the movements, the possessions, and the missing young man whose name remains at the center of the file. We do not dwell on harm tonight. We dwell on the careful way investigators listened, compared, returned, and asked again. That kind of listening is its own labor. You can imagine a detective lowering their eyes to a note, not to break contact harshly, but to make sure the next question is precise. Precision matters when a case is this serious. The wrong word can blur a fact. The wrong assumption can send a file sideways. So the investigator asks carefully, where were you? Who was with you? What happened next? What did you do with the vehicle? What did you do with the card? Those questions may sound simple, but simplicity can be a strong tool. It leaves less room for ornament. It asks the speaker to return to the ground. As you sit beside the lamp tonight, you can see why the Spearfish case depended on these plain questions, repeated over time and tied back to evidence that had already been gathered. The file was not asking anyone to solve a riddle. It was asking the truth to stop moving. There is a certain quietness after a confession enters a case file, not peace. Exactly. something more complicated than that. The search for what happened may become clearer, but the emotional burden does not vanish. Families do not receive back the person they loved. Detectives do not forget the work. The community does not simply close the drawer and become untouched. A solved case can still be a sorrowful case. We keep that in mind as the Spearfish case moves toward court. The legal pages are more formal, and their language can feel distant from the house, the bank card, the road, and the young man whose life anchors everything. But those pages matter because they preserve accountability. They describe charges, pleas, testimony, sentencing, appeals, and the slow public process by which evidence becomes judgment. You may feel the shift from investigation to record, from handwritten notes to typed legal argument. Courtrooms have their own sensory quiet, wood polished by many hands, paper laid flat beside a microphone, the faint rustle of coats as people sit, a clock that seems louder during pauses than it should. In the Spearfish case, the courtroom became another place where the evidence had to be handled carefully. What had been gathered in offices, vehicles, banks, and interviews now had to stand in a room built for scrutiny. You can imagine the jurors or judges hearing about the ordinary objects: a vehicle, a card, property, statements, travel. Each piece was no longer just an entry in an investigator's file. It became part of a public account of what happened after Chester disappeared from the safe boundaries of his ordinary life. The oddness of the evidence had to be explained, and the explanation had to hold under pressure. The patience of the case did not end with conviction. Appeals continued, sentences were examined, legal decisions were reviewed over time, because that too is part of the process. We may feel tired just thinking of the years, but the law is often built from years. It moves through calendars, filings, deadlines, and hearings, and sometimes the old file has to be opened again under a different light. In that way, the Spearfish case asks us to think about several kinds of patience at once. There is the patience of investigators who gather facts. There is the patience of families who wait through unbearable uncertainty. There is the patience of courts, which move through procedure. And there is the patience of a record, which sits on a shelf long after the immediate urgency has faded, still holding what people said and what people did. You can hear the shelves in that thought if you let yourself. Metal brackets, cardboard boxes, case numbers written in black marker, a file pulled out years later with a soft scrape and a breath of dust. The Spearfish case may be solved in the legal sense, but it still lives in records this way, as all solved cases do. The paper remains because memory needs somewhere to rest. The strange part is how much of the truth depended on things without voices. Plastic, metal, paper, a vehicle, a bank machine, a receipt, a label on an evidence bag. These things did not care about blame or fear, and perhaps that is why they could help. They held their small facts until someone patient enough came along to read them in relation to each other. As you sit with the Spearfish case tonight, you may find yourself thinking about how evidence changes when placed beside other evidence. A bank record alone is a bank record. A vehicle recovery alone is a vehicle recovery. A missing item alone is a missing item. But together, under careful attention, they become a kind of map. Not a perfect map, and not an easy one, but a map detectives could follow toward the answer. The map did not erase the grief. That is worth saying softly. Solving the case did not turn the story into something tidy. It only showed how determined work can meet a terrible absence with facts, and how facts can help a family and a community know what they are facing. You can let that thought sit beside you without trying to fix it. Some parts of a case can only be acknowledged. When we talk about weird evidence, we are also talking about humility. Investigators cannot always know, in the first hours, which object will matter most. They collect because they do not yet know. They preserve because time may change what can be understood. They write things down because memory will soften. In the Spearfish case, The small, practical details became meaningful because someone kept them from slipping away. You can picture the early reports being assembled. A printer hums. A phone rings once in another room. Someone writes a time in the margin. Someone else checks a license plate, a bank record, a property list. The work is plain, almost quiet enough to miss, but it is the work that later allows a prosecutor to tell a coherent story and allows a court to understand why the evidence points where it does. There is a tenderness, too, in the way investigators often speak of victims through ordinary details, not as symbols, not as headlines, as people who had cars, cards, rooms, belongings, appointments, habits, and families who knew the sound of their steps. Chester Poage appears in the Spearfish case through those ordinary details, and that is part of why the file feels so human. The things around him mattered because he mattered first. We can rest there for a breath, with the lamp warm and the pages open. The story has a legal shape now, but the human shape is still underneath it. You may feel the two shapes overlapping, one made of charges and evidence, the other made of family memory and absence. A good investigation has to honor both. It has to be exact without becoming cold. The next pages bring us to the way the case was understood after the arrests. Once the names were known and the evidence had been arranged, the public story began to form. Newspapers, court records, and community memory each carried pieces of the Spearfish case forward. But official memory and personal memory do not move at the same pace. One is filed. The other wakes up in kitchens, in conversations, in anniversaries, and in quiet moments when a person is missed. You can imagine a family member hearing a detail repeated in court that they had already carried privately for months. That repetition can be difficult. It can also be necessary. The law has to say out loud what the evidence supports, and that spoken record becomes part of the path toward accountability. We keep our voice low here because the people closest to Chester did not experience the case as a puzzle. They experienced it as a loss with a long paper trail attached. That long paper trail included the unusual, ordinary things we have been following: the card, the blazer, the property, the route, the statements. If you were the detective tonight, sitting with the archive box in front of you, you might make a small column in your notebook for each one. Then you might draw lines between them, not hurried lines, but patient ones, until the page shows the same shape the case eventually took. The shape of a solved case can seem obvious afterward. That is one of the illusions of hindsight. Once we know the answer, the clues appear to have been waiting with labels on them. But at the time, each clue had to be recognized without the comfort of certainty. Someone had to decide that a bank transaction mattered. Someone had to decide that a possession should be traced. Someone had to ask why the vehicle was where it was. Those decisions are made in real time, with incomplete information and ordinary fatigue. Detectives get tired. Dispatchers get tired. Families get tired in a deeper way. The weather changes. Phones ring. Files move from one desk to another. In the Spearfish case, the eventual clarity came from people continuing to do the next practical thing, even when the whole picture was not yet available. That is a quiet form of devotion. You can hear the night around that work. The outside world may have been very still, with cold air against windows and the dull glow of streetlights on pavement. Inside, a detective might have been reading a statement under fluorescent light, while a copier warmed somewhere down the hall. The smell of toner, paper, coffee, and damp wool coats belongs to this kind of investigation. It is not dramatic, but it stays with you. As we continue through the Spearfish case, the legal aftermath begins to stretch the timeline. The arrests and convictions did not create a sudden end to the paperwork. There were further proceedings, and the case remained part of public record for years. You can feel how time gathers around legal files. each new document placed on top of the last, each filing adding another layer to what had already happened. The court record becomes a second archive beside the investigative one. Appeals can feel remote from the original facts, but they are not separate from them. They ask whether the process was handled properly. They examine decisions, sentences, arguments, and rights. In a case as serious as Spearfish, those examinations were part of the long road after the first investigation. We may not linger on every legal detail tonight, because our purpose is sleep and steady attention, but we can notice the patience required there too. The courtroom language may be dry, yet it holds human consequence. A phrase in an opinion can represent months of work. A ruling can carry years of waiting. A sentence can mark the place where the state names the weight of what happened. You might imagine the paper in those court files as smoother, more formal, less touched by mud, weather, and field notes, but still connected to the same first questions from Spearfish. This is one of the reasons the case remains powerful as a study in evidence. It shows how small facts must travel. They begin as observations. They become report entries. They become exhibits or testimony. They become part of legal findings. At each stage, the detail has to survive handling. If it was gathered carelessly, it may weaken. If it was documented well, it can continue to speak. You can see then why the mundane evidence matters so much. A bank card is only useful if the record is obtained correctly and understood clearly. A vehicle is only useful if its history is traced, its condition noted, and its connection to people established. Property is only useful if it can be identified and linked. In the Spearfish case, each modest thing had to be carried across that bridge from clue to proof. The bridge is made of paperwork. That may sound almost too simple, but it is true. Reports, logs, chain of custody forms, interview notes, warrants, transaction records, photographs, court filings. You can almost feel the weight of them in your hands. Not one heavy book, but many thin pages that together become substantial. The paper is where patience becomes visible. It is where the slow work leaves a trace. There is comfort, in a sober way, in knowing that careful work can matter. It cannot prevent every harm. It cannot return every person, but it can resist confusion. It can say that Chester Poage was not allowed to vanish into rumor, and that the odd things left behind were followed until they formed an account. That is not a happy thought, exactly. It is a grounded one, and grounded thoughts can be held quietly at night. You might let your eyes drift over the imagined file tab: Spearfish, Poage, Evidence, Interviews, Court. Those words are plain, but they carry a life's worth of consequence. We sit beside them with respect. The file does not need us to make it more intense. It needs us to read with care, to remember the people in it, and to notice how methodical attention turned disorder into a record. The weird evidence in this case also reminds us that truth can hide in the habits of daily life. People use cards. They drive vehicles. They move belongings. They stop for fuel. They speak to friends. They leave things in rooms, pockets, bags, and glove compartments. Most days, none of it matters beyond the day itself. But when someone is missing, the ordinary world becomes an archive, and every small action may acquire meaning. That transformation must be handled gently. Not every object is a clue. Not every witness has the right memory. Not every odd detail belongs to the central answer. Investigators have to sort without becoming careless, and without becoming so rigid that they miss the human texture of the case. In Spearfish, the important details emerged because they were not treated as isolated curiosities. They were placed in context. Context is the quiet craft of investigation. A bank withdrawal means one thing if the cardholder is present and well. It means another if the cardholder has disappeared. A vehicle seen on the road means one thing in ordinary life. It means another when the person who owns it cannot be found. You can feel how context changes the temperature of evidence, not by making it louder, but by making it specific. The same is true of property. A borrowed item, a sold item, a misplaced item, and a stolen item can all look similar from a distance. The work is in getting close enough to tell the difference. That takes interviews. It takes records. It takes family members identifying what belonged to whom. It takes investigators listening when someone says, "Yes, that was his," or "No, he would not have given that away." Such moments can be very quiet and very important. You can imagine a table where personal belongings are laid out for identification. No one speaks quickly in that room. The air feels still. A photograph may be placed beside an object. A relative may lean forward, recognizing something ordinary with a heaviness that only recognition can carry. In the Spearfish case, as in many cases, the ordinary was not neutral. It carried memory. We keep returning to that because it keeps the investigation human. Evidence is not only technical, it touches families, officers, clerks, attorneys, judges, and jurors. It asks each of them to carry a small part of the truth carefully. In the Spearfish case, the odd evidence had to be gathered by people, explained by people, and received by people who understood that behind every exhibit was Chester's unfinished life. There is another detail we can sit with, and that is the role of distance. Spearfish itself is not a sprawling city, where anonymity is easy to imagine. It is a community set among hills and open roads, a place where movements can still be difficult to reconstruct if they happen quickly and across county lines. Distance in such a case is not only miles, it is the distance between what family believed and what had happened, between early uncertainty and later knowledge. Maps help with one kind of distance. They do not help with the other. You can run your finger along a highway and measure the drive, but you cannot measure the emotional length of waiting for news. The Spearfish case moved along both kinds of distance at once. Investigators followed roads and records, while Chester's family endured the slower distance of not knowing, then knowing too much, and then waiting for the courts to finish their work. The file does not show every private hour. It cannot. It gives us the official trace. But as we read, we can remember the unseen hours around it. A phone kept close, a knock at the door, a sleepless night, a conversation that pauses when someone enters the room. These are not dramatic additions. They are the human atmosphere around any serious case, and they help us read the file with tenderness. By now, the Spearfish case has become a study in how clarity can be assembled from the edges. The center of the story was difficult and sorrowful, so investigators worked around it through evidence that could be checked. The blazer, the card, the belongings, the statements, each one stood near the edge of what happened, and together they helped point inward. You can imagine the file like a circle slowly closing. That image is not meant to feel tense. It is simply how the work often proceeds. You cannot always begin at the center. Sometimes the center is hidden. Sometimes the people who know it are not ready to speak truthfully. So you begin with what can be known: a time, a location, a transaction, an object, a witness. Then you return, again and again, until the center becomes less hidden than it was. The patience required for that is not glamorous. It is not the kind of patience that appears in a single cinematic moment. It is the patience of reading poor photocopies, calling back witnesses, waiting for records, driving routes, reviewing statements, and checking whether one person's account matches another's. In the Spearfish case, that patience gave the weird evidence room to become useful. It let ordinary things accumulate into something strong. You can rest your hands for a moment on the imagined folder. The paper is cool at first, then warmer where your palms touch it. The room is quiet except for the low sound of the house around you, a clock perhaps, or the distant settling of wood. We are deep enough into the file now that the early confusion feels far away, but we should not forget it. Every solved case once stood at the beginning, uncertain and open. That beginning matters because it shows what investigators had to overcome. They did not start with a neat account. They started with a missing young man and a scattering of facts. They had to decide which facts belonged together. They had to ask whether the card, the vehicle, and the property were coincidences or signals. They had to keep working while the answer was still painful and incomplete. The Spearfish case was not solved by impatience. That is one of the gentlest truths in it. It was solved by the slow friction between statements and facts, by the pressure of records, by evidence that would not quite fit the wrong explanations. You can feel that friction in the file, not as heat, but as resistance. A story is offered, and the evidence quietly refuses to become the shape of it. When evidence refuses a false shape, investigators have to notice. That may sound obvious, but it takes discipline. People can become attached to early theories. Communities can fill silence with rumor. Families can be given partial answers that do not hold. The better path is slower. In Spearfish, the path moved through verification, and verification is one of the calmest words in detective work. To verify is to go back. It means you do not accept the first version simply because it is available. You compare it. You test it. You look for another record. You ask another person. You drive the route if you need to. You listen again to the tape, read again the transcript, and check again the time. This is how a case becomes less dependent on assumption and more dependent on fact. The sensory world of that work is modest. A highlighter squeaks faintly across a line. A file drawer closes with a heavy metal sound. A phone cord twists under someone's fingers. A notepad fills with names, numbers, and arrows. Outside, the wind may move against the building, and inside, the investigator keeps reading. You and I can sit with that image because it matches the pace of the case better than anything hurried would. There is another reason the evidence feels unusual. It showed behavior after the disappearance. That is often powerful in an investigation because the period after an event can be revealing. People make choices. They use what they should not have. They travel where they later have to explain. They speak to others. They try to turn the page before the page is ready to turn. In the Spearfish case, those after actions helped investigators understand the before. You can think of it like footprints in soft ground after a snowfall. We do not need to describe anything harsh to understand the usefulness of a trail. Each mark says only that someone passed this way. The pattern says more when the marks are taken together. A card use here, a vehicle there, an item somewhere else. A statement that shifts. The Spearfish case became legible through those quiet impressions. No single impression needed to shout. That is important for the tone of our reading tonight. We do not make an exhibit larger than it was. We do not turn an ATM record into a dramatic centerpiece. We let it be a small, steady thing among other small, steady things. Its strength comes from company. It stands beside the blazer, beside the property, beside the interviews, and together they form the road. The road leads us back, again and again, to Chester Poage. It is easy in long cases to speak so much of evidence that the person at the center becomes a name on a tab. We should not let that happen. Chester was 19. He had people who expected him to come home, and a life that reached into ordinary places around Spearfish. Every fact in the case matters, because it belongs to the effort to account for what happened to him. You can feel how young 19 is when the file says it plainly. Young enough that much of life is still possibility. Young enough that ordinary plans still stretch forward with a kind of open light. The law has to speak in charges and findings, but we can hold the human truth beside it. A young man was gone, and the investigation was the community's way of refusing to let that absence remain unnamed. The next layer of the case turns toward the people who worked it. We often speak of detectives as though they are functions, but they are people too, moving through long days with responsibility on their shoulders. They have to ask questions that hurt. They have to sit with families in rooms where no sentence feels adequate. They have to keep the file precise while knowing that every page represents someone's worst season. In the Spearfish case, that burden would have been shared by local officers, county authorities, prosecutors, and others who helped move the evidence into the legal system. You can picture them not as figures in a drama, but as tired professionals under ordinary light, carrying folders, making calls, checking details. Their patience was not abstract. It lived in tasks. It lived in accuracy. It lived in coming back the next day to continue. That continuity matters. A case can falter when attention breaks. Records can be misplaced, memories can fade, and small details can lose their connection to the larger picture. The Spearfish case moved quickly compared with some cold cases, but it still relied on continuity across the investigation and court process. The people responsible had to keep the thread unbroken, from the first concern to the final legal findings. You may hear the phrase chain of custody in this part of the file. It sounds technical, and it is, but it is also a promise. It says an object was collected, marked, stored, transferred, and presented in a way that can be trusted. For physical evidence, that promise matters deeply. In a case where ordinary objects became meaningful, the chain around those objects had to remain steady. Think of an evidence bag with an item inside, sealed at the top, initials written across the closure. It rests on a shelf under fluorescent light. Days pass, then weeks. Someone signs it out. Someone signs it back in. The bag itself is not dramatic, but the record attached to it is part of the reason the object can speak later in court. Patience, again, becomes a matter of handwriting and care. The same is true for financial records. A transaction must be obtained through proper channels. It must be matched to an account, a date, and sometimes a location or machine. It must be interpreted without stretching it beyond what it can prove. In the Spearfish case, the card evidence was important because it fitted into the larger pattern. It was not asked to be more than it was, and that restraint gave it strength. Restraint is a quiet virtue in investigation. It means saying only what the evidence supports. It means leaving room for uncertainty until uncertainty has been reduced honestly. It means not turning suspicion into certainty too soon. You can feel that restraint in a well-made file. The language is careful. The dates are clear. The statements are attributed. The evidence is placed where it belongs. As listeners and as quiet readers tonight, we can practice the same restraint. We do not have to imagine beyond what serves the case. We do not have to add darkness where the known facts are already serious. We can stay with the objects, the records, the people, and the patient method. That is enough. The Spearfish case gives us enough to understand how odd evidence can become proof when handled with care. The air in the room around our imagined file feels a little later now. Perhaps the lamp has made a warm circle on the desk, while the rest of the room has gone soft at the edges. You turn another page and find yourself in the court years, where names, sentences, and appeals lengthen the story beyond the original investigation. This part can feel procedural, but procedure is where society tries to give weight to truth without letting emotion alone decide. Elijah Page, Briley Piper, and Darrell Hoadley each moved through the legal system in ways that became part of the public record. The details of their proceedings varied, and the later history of the case included serious sentencing decisions and review. We do not need to sharpen those facts tonight. We can let them stand as part of the long aftermath. The important point for our quiet reading is that the evidence carried the case into accountability. Accountability is not the same as repair. That distinction matters. A court can determine responsibility, but it cannot put time back where it was. It cannot return the young man at the center of the Spearfish case to the people who loved him. It can only name, judge, and preserve a record. That limitation gives the solved case its particular sadness, because even certainty arrives with empty hands. Still, there is value in certainty. Families often say that not knowing has its own weight, and the weight can be endless. In the Spearfish case, investigators were able to bring forward an answer, and that answer rested on careful evidence rather than rumor. You can feel the importance of that distinction. Rumor moves like smoke. Evidence, when gathered well, has weight enough to stay. We can hold both truths at once. The answer mattered, and it did not make the loss whole. The evidence solved the case, and it did not soften the fact of Chester's absence. The legal process reached conclusions, and the family still had to live in the years beyond them. A mature file contains these contradictions without resolving them neatly. We can sit with them calmly, because calm is not the same as indifference. The next document in our imagined stack might be a court opinion, with formal lines and numbered paragraphs written in a voice far removed from the first missing person concerns. You see how language changes as a case travels through institutions. The warmth of family memory becomes the precision of law. The physical texture of evidence becomes the phrasing of admissibility, findings, and sentence. Yet beneath all that formal language, the same core facts remain. You may run your finger down the page and find references to statements, property, and the chain of events. The odd evidence is still there, translated into legal terms. That translation is one of the quiet miracles of patient work. A thing found, a record obtained, a question answered, all have to become language that can survive review. In the Spearfish case, that translation helped ensure the outcome was not merely believed, but documented. Documentation can feel cold, but it is often an act of care. It preserves what grief alone cannot preserve. It gives future readers, judges, journalists, family members, and citizens a way to see what was known and how it was known. You and I, sitting years later with the case in mind, depend on that care. Without it, the story would blur into fragments. With it, the evidence keeps its shape. The shape is still difficult. We should not pretend otherwise. But difficult things can be approached gently. That is the whole purpose of the voice we use tonight. We take a case that could be told harshly, and we choose instead to focus on patience, documentation, and the human need for answers. We let the room stay quiet. We let the names remain names, not symbols. We let the facts arrive without forcing them. In a later part of the file, you may find the case described by others as solved through strange evidence, and that phrase may catch your attention again. Strange evidence often means evidence nobody would have expected to matter at first glance. It is the receipt in a pocket, the fiber on a seat, the call on a bill, the bank record in a ledger, the object sold too quickly. In Spearfish, the strange evidence was the ordinary world refusing to disappear. That refusal is worth thinking about. The ordinary world records us constantly, especially when we move through it without care. We leave impressions in systems, in objects, in other people's memories. Most of those impressions vanish into daily life. But when investigators begin looking, some impressions remain. In the Spearfish case, enough remained to show what had happened and who was responsible. You can imagine the investigators reaching the point where the file no longer felt like scattered reports. It may have felt, instead, like a structure. Not perfect, perhaps, but strong enough to stand. The card record supported the timeline. The property supported the account. The vehicle supported the movement. The statements gave the human admissions and explanations that the physical evidence could test. The structure rose slowly, piece by piece. There is calm satisfaction in structure, though not in the reason it was needed. A detective may feel relief when a case becomes clear, while also feeling the sadness of what the clarity reveals. That mixed feeling belongs here. We do not turn it into triumph. We let it be sober, because the Spearfish case was never about cleverness for its own sake. It was about Chester Poage. and about the community's obligation to account for his disappearance and death. When we return to the first pages after seeing the later ones, they look different. The missing vehicle now seems more significant. The card use seems less isolated. The property list seems less administrative. The names carry more weight. This is how hindsight works, and it can be useful if we remember that the investigators did not have it at the beginning. They earned it through work. You might close your eyes for a moment and picture the case file not as a flat stack, but as a room. On one wall is a map of Spearfish and the surrounding roads. On another wall are transaction times and dates. On a table are evidence bags and photographs. In the center is a chair where witnesses sat, one after another, giving accounts that had to be weighed. The room is quiet now, but once it held many questions. We move through that room slowly because each area has something to teach. The map teaches movement. The bank records teach timing. The property teaches possession. The interviews teach behavior. The court documents teach accountability. Together, they teach patience. And patience, more than any single clue, is the thread we keep feeling beneath the whole Spearfish case. There is a subtle kindness in patient investigation, even when the work itself is hard. It says the lost person is worth the hours. It says the family's questions are worth the paperwork. It says the community's need for truth is worth the careful drive, the second interview, the repeated call, and the long night at the desk. In this file, patience is not passive. It is active, steady, and deliberate. The evidence in the Spearfish case also shows how wrongdoing often creates practical problems for the people involved. They have to explain a vehicle. They have to explain money. They have to explain possessions. They have to explain why their movements do not match innocent expectations. The more they move through the ordinary world, the more the ordinary world records them. Investigators simply have to keep asking the world what it remembers. That phrase may sound soft, but it is accurate. Ask the bank what it remembers. Ask the road what it remembers through sightings and fuel stops. Ask the property what it remembers through ownership and possession. Ask the witness what they remember. Then ask the record whether memory and fact can stand together. The Spearfish case was solved by that kind of broad, patient asking. You can hear a detective's pen moving as those answers come in. Not fast, just steadily. A name here, a time there, a correction in the margin. The handwriting may grow less neat late in the day, but the effort continues. Outside, the Black Hills would still be there in their dark winter shape, and the town would move through ordinary evenings while the file on Chester grew thicker. There is something especially moving about a file growing thicker for the sake of one person. Each page is a sign that someone did not stop. A form completed, a record requested, a statement taken, an item logged, a court document filed. The stack may look bureaucratic, but beneath it is a moral statement. This life mattered enough for the facts to be pursued. We can let that be the feeling that carries us into the next portion of the case. Not intensity, not suspense, just the steady awareness that every object we have named had to be noticed, and every record had to be read. The Spearfish case was solved because the strange evidence did not remain strange forever. Under patient attention, it became understandable, and under careful handling, it became part of the truth. The next page waits under your fingertips, and its edges are a little worn, as though many hands have come back to this same place over the years, checking how one small fact rests against another. You let that page rest open, and for a while, the Spearfish case feels less like a story and more like a table of quiet objects, waiting to be understood. A bank card is there, thin and ordinary. A vehicle is there, heavy with distance. A list of belongings is there too, typed in plain language, each item carrying a little piece of context. We sit with them without haste, because haste would make the evidence flatter than it was. When investigators return to an object, They were not only asking what it was, they were asking where it had been, who touched it, who mentioned it, who ignored it, and whether it matched the account being offered. You can imagine a detective lifting a page slightly, comparing one line with another, then making a quiet mark in the margin. The mark is small. The decision behind it is not small at all, because that is how a fact begins to hold its place. The Spearfish case had a way of making common things feel almost formal. A vehicle was no longer only a vehicle. It became a timeline with tires. A card was no longer only a card. It became a record of access, habit, and opportunity. Belongings were no longer only belongings. They became proof that something in Chester's ordinary world had been rearranged by other hands, and that rearrangement needed to be explained. You may notice, as we keep reading, how often solved cases depend on the order in which facts become known. If investigators had looked only at one thing, the case might have seemed uncertain for longer. If they had treated the transaction as separate from the vehicle, or the property as separate from the statements, the pattern might have stayed dim. In the Spearfish case, the patient work was the work of placing things next to each other until they began to form a line. That line did not run straight at first. It moved through interviews, records, and practical questions about who had access to what. It moved through the kind of tasks that fill a detective's day without becoming memorable later. Phone calls, notes, requests, follow-ups, waiting for someone to call back, waiting for paperwork to arrive, waiting for a person to say the same thing twice, or to say something slightly different the second time. There is a soft texture to that waiting when you imagine it from a distance. The office light has a faint buzz. The carpet has been walked over by many shoes. The walls hold maps, calendars, and notices that no one really sees anymore. A detective sits with the Spearfish case and turns the question over again, not dramatically, just steadily. Where did the card go? Where did the blazer go? Where did Chester's things go? The questions gather force because they are linked. A bank card can be explained badly. A missing vehicle can be explained badly. A possession in the wrong place can be explained badly. But when several bad explanations stand beside each other, they begin to reveal the strain. You can almost feel that strain in the file, like a thread pulled too tightly across a page. The truth does not appear in a flash. It presses through the weak places. We stay close to the method because method is what makes the case useful to revisit at night. There is no need for sharpness. There is no need to make the room darker. The facts are serious enough on their own. What matters is how investigators made sense of them, and how the odd evidence in the Spearfish case became less odd as it joined a larger pattern. You turn another page, and the document is a little different now. Perhaps it is a witness statement, or a report summarizing a conversation, with names and times placed in careful rows. A statement carries more breath than a bank record. It comes from a person, and people bring uncertainty with them. You can hear a chair shifting in a small room, the low murmur of a question, and the pause before an answer is given. In that pause, investigators listen for more than words. They listen for sequence. They listen for whether the order makes sense. They listen for places where a person seems to be remembering, and places where a person seems to be constructing. We do not have to judge too quickly. We only sit beside the process and notice how, in the Spearfish case, statements became meaningful because they could be held against the physical and financial record. This is why the evidence mattered so deeply. It gave the conversation a frame. Without the card record, a question might drift. Without the vehicle, a route might remain vague. Without the property, possession might be dismissed as rumor. There is a calm fairness in that, even in a grave case. Evidence protects against guessing. It asks everyone, investigators included, to slow down and be exact. It can challenge a suspect story, but it can also protect the truth from becoming distorted by anger or fear. In the Spearfish case, the odd evidence helped give the investigation a kind of balance. because it kept bringing the work back to what could be shown. You might picture the detective reviewing a statement late at night, using a finger to hold one place, while the eyes move to another page. The desk lamp makes a small gold pool on the paper. The room beyond is dark blue at the edges. There is a pen nearby, uncapped for too long. The ink smell faint, but present. The Spearfish case sits there, and the detective reads again, because reading again is sometimes what solves things. When you read again, different details rise. The first time, you may notice a name. The second time, a time. The third time, a small inconsistency that did not seem important until the bank record arrived. This is one of the old rhythms of investigation. New evidence changes the meaning of old evidence. A detail that looked minor yesterday can become central tomorrow once it has something to lean against. The bank card is an example of that. In ordinary life, using a card is barely memorable. You press buttons, take cash, put the receipt somewhere, and go on with your day. But in the Spearfish case, that small transaction was separated from ordinary life by Chester's disappearance. It no longer belonged to routine. It became a question. And a question, if it is preserved carefully, can lead to an answer. There is a particular stillness in financial evidence. It has no expression. It carries no tone. It is made of times, amounts, locations, and account numbers, all reduced to clean little lines. Yet those clean little lines can enter a human story with enormous force. You can imagine investigators looking at the record and feeling the case become narrower, not solved in that moment, but less open than it had been before. Narrowing is a quiet achievement. It means there are fewer possibilities to chase, fewer false paths to walk, and fewer shadows where a bad explanation can rest. The Spearfish case narrowed through ordinary evidence, and that is part of what makes it worth considering carefully. A person disappeared. The world around him continued to create records. Investigators followed those records until the disorder became more legible. As we move deeper, it helps to think about the difference between clue and proof. A clue points, proof supports. A clue can be suggestive, but proof has to endure. In the Spearfish case, the weird evidence became powerful because it was not left as suggestion. It was checked, paired, documented, and eventually carried into court, where it had to stand under a brighter and more formal light. That formal light can be harsh for everyone involved. Witnesses may have to speak about painful things. Families may have to listen. Attorneys may challenge details that feel obvious to those who lived through them. Judges and jurors have to consider facts with disciplined attention. The Spearfish case moved into that process, and the evidence had to make the journey with it, still intact, still clear, still carefully marked. You can imagine the exhibit table in court. The objects are not glowing with meaning in any visible way. They are simply there, named and numbered, placed in the hands of the legal system. A person who has never seen them before has to understand why they matter. That is the work of testimony and documentation. It turns a private investigation into a public account. Public accounts have to be slower than emotion. They ask, what do we know? How do we know it? Who can say so? What record supports it? In the Spearfish case, those questions reached back to the first practical steps: the vehicle checks, the transaction records, the recovered property, and the statements gathered by investigators. The court did not receive an atmosphere. It received a structure. A structure built from ordinary evidence can be surprisingly strong. It does not depend on one dramatic beam. It depends on many smaller supports, each placed carefully enough to hold its share. If one support is questioned, others remain. If one memory is imperfect, a record may steady it. If one statement shifts, an object may still sit where it has been logged. That is why patient investigation can outlast confusion. You may feel, as we read, that the Spearfish case keeps returning to the same few items. That repetition is not an error. It is the nature of the case. The same evidence had to be revisited by investigators, prosecutors, courts, and later readers trying to understand how the answer emerged. Each return adds a little more meaning. The card is financial evidence, then timeline evidence, then behavior evidence. The vehicle is transportation, then possession, then movement, then corroboration. Repetition is also how a family may experience a case. The same facts are heard again and again, first from investigators, then in reports, then in court, then in later retellings. Each time, the facts may sound both familiar and unreal. We keep our tone low because those repetitions belong to real people. Chester's family did not receive the Spearfish case as an interesting pattern. They received it as the record of a life they loved. There is a kindness in remembering that before every piece of evidence, there was daily life. A kitchen table, a driveway, a phone call, a young man's belongings in places where they made sense. The investigation began because that daily life was broken. When we speak of cards, vehicles, and property, we are speaking of the traces left behind when ordinary order was disturbed. The evidence matters because the ordinary order mattered. You can sit with that idea as the page turns. The next part of the file may discuss how investigators connected the men to Chester and to the evidence. These connections were not made by assumption alone. They were made through proximity, statements, possession, travel, and the accounts that eventually emerged. In the Spearfish case, the clarity came through convergence, the quiet meeting of many lines in one place. Convergence is a patient word. It suggests things coming together without hurry, like streams meeting in a valley after taking separate paths through the hills. A witness account flows in one direction, a bank record flows in another, a vehicle report carries its own current. Property evidence moves beside them. Eventually, if the work is sound, the streams meet, and the investigator can see the shape of the land more clearly. The land around Spearfish gives that image a natural feeling. The Black Hills are old, rounded, and wooded, with roads that bend through rock, pine, and open sky. You can picture cold air moving through the trees, the smell of earth and snowmelt, the sound of tires on damp pavement. The case itself is not scenery, but place matters. It gives the facts a physical home, and it reminds us that every investigation happens somewhere, under a particular sky. In this case, that somewhere included a college town, rural roads, law offices, family homes, interview rooms, and courtrooms. Each location held a different part of the process. The house held the first disruption, the roads held movement, the bank records held timing, the interview rooms held words, the courtroom held accountability. We move among them gently, as though carrying a lamp from room to room. The first room, the house, asks us to think about access. Who could enter? Who knew where things were? Who could take property without creating immediate alarm? Access is a practical word, but it carries emotional weight. It implies familiarity or opportunity. In the Spearfish case, questions of access helped investigators understand how Chester's belongings, card, and vehicle became part of the later pattern. You may imagine an officer walking through the space, not with melodrama, but with care. A doorway, a hallway, a table, a place where keys might have been, a place where a wallet might have rested. The room holds ordinary smells, dust, fabric, maybe the faint scent of cleaning products, or winter air from an open door. Each place invites a question. What belonged here? What is missing? What has changed? From that room, the file moves outward. The blazer leaves the driveway in the record of the case, and once it leaves, it becomes a moving clue. Vehicles are useful because they connect interiors to landscapes. They carry people across distances that can later be measured. They may be seen, borrowed, abandoned, recovered, or described by others. In the Spearfish case, Chester's vehicle became one of the case's most important markers. We can think of the blazer as a kind of silent line drawn across the map. It does not tell us why it traveled. It only tells us that it did. Investigators then ask who could have drawn that line and what other evidence travels near it. The bank card moves in time. The property moves through possession. Statements move through memory. When those movements begin to align, the line on the map becomes harder to dismiss. There is a reason detectives often build timelines on walls or boards. A timeline lets the eye see gaps and clusters. It lets one page speak to another. In the Spearfish case, the timeline would have had Chester's last known contacts, the movement of his property, uses of his card, travels of his vehicle, interviews, arrests, and court events. You can imagine colored pins or handwritten notes. Though the actual format matters less than the discipline behind it, a good timeline is a place where patience becomes visible. It shows what is known, what is uncertain, and where new information must fit. If a statement cannot fit, the statement must be examined. If a transaction appears after an event, the transaction becomes significant. If a possession appears in the wrong hands, the possession becomes a question. The timeline does not accuse. Its arrangement can be powerful. A messy table of facts can feel overwhelming, but when the facts are ordered by time, their relationships begin to show. In the Spearfish case, ordering was essential because the evidence came from different sources: financial records, witness statements, vehicle information, property recovery, and admissions. Each had their own texture. The investigator's work was to bring them into the same calm line. You can hear the pencil moving along that line. It stops at a date, it circles a time, it draws a small arrow toward a name. None of this would look impressive to someone expecting drama, but to a patient detective, this is where the case begins to breathe. Facts that were scattered across pages begin to answer each other. The case is not solved by a single sound. It is solved by alignment. Alignment is especially important when more than one person is involved. The statements of Elijah Page, Briley Piper, and Darrell Hoadley each had to be considered in relation to the evidence and to one another. Investigators had to determine what matched, what conflicted, and what could be independently supported. That is difficult work because people connected to a serious case may have reasons to minimize, shift, or withhold. The evidence becomes the steady surface beneath the words. We speak of them carefully here, not to soften accountability, but to keep our tone faithful to the record. The Spearfish case was not solved by shouting names into the dark. It was solved by placing names within documented actions and statements. The law needs that kind of care. A person is not made central because a story sounds convincing. A person is made central because facts, records, and testimony connect them in ways that can be shown. The interviews, then, were more than conversations. They were places where the evidence tested the speakers and the speakers tested the evidence. One statement might explain an object. Another might contradict a route. A third might confirm something investigators already suspected. You can imagine the slow process of comparing those accounts, page after page, with the lamp warm and the night around the windows. Sometimes the most revealing part of a statement is not the main sentence. It is a side detail, a name mentioned too casually, a time placed where it cannot fit, an object described before it should be known. Investigators learn to listen for those small shifts, not because every small shift means deception, but because some do. In the Spearfish case, the broader pattern allowed smaller details to matter. You can picture an investigator underlining a phrase, then writing a note beside it. Check with bank record. Compare vehicle timeline. Ask witness again. These notes are not conclusions. They are invitations to verify. The file grows through such invitations. Each one sends the detective back into the world, to a phone, a record, a location, or another interview. The result is slow, but it is stronger than guessing. The word solved can sometimes make a case sound simpler than it was. It compresses many hours into one finished label, but we know, sitting here together, that solved can contain hundreds of small acts. It can contain the careful handling of evidence, the difficult gathering of statements, the discipline of prosecutors, the deliberation of courts, and the enduring attention of families who refuse to let a name fade. In the Spearfish case, solved is a word made of many quieter words. One of those quieter words is preservation. Evidence that is not preserved cannot help later. A card record has to be retrieved. A vehicle has to be examined and documented. Property has to be identified and stored. Statements have to be recorded accurately. In this case, preservation allowed the odd evidence to remain available when it was needed, instead of dissolving into memory and rumor. Preservation has a physical feeling, a plastic sleeve around a document, a seal across a bag, a folder tab labeled in black ink, a box placed on a shelf where temperature, dust, and time will still try to make everything older. You can almost smell that shelf as we imagine it. Cardboard warmed by years, old paper, adhesive, and metal cabinets. It is the scent of a case becoming archive, but before it became archive, it was active and urgent in the quiet professional sense. People had to respond. People had to gather. People had to decide what came next. The Spearfish case did not begin as a lesson in evidence. It began as concern for Chester. The lesson came afterward, as each strange, practical fact helped pull the investigation away from uncertainty and toward legal truth. That movement toward truth is not always smooth. There may be delays, repeated interviews, incomplete memories, and moments when a lead seems promising and then gives very little. We do not need to know every empty path to understand that they existed. Every investigation has them. The important thing is that the useful paths were not abandoned. The card was followed. The blazer was followed. The property was followed. The statements were followed. Following evidence requires a quiet acceptance that the file leads where it leads. You may want a different answer. You may hope for something less painful. But evidence is not built to comfort. It is built to clarify. In the Spearfish case, clarification brought accountability. Though it could not make the facts gentle, the gentleness has to come from how we handle the telling. So we tell it by staying close to the work. We imagine the investigator's desk, not the worst moments. We imagine the evidence shelf, the bank record, the map, the interview transcript, and the courtroom papers. We give Chester's name room to remain human. We give the family's waiting room to be acknowledged. We give the investigator's patience room to be seen. That is enough for tonight's slow reading. The next section of the file may bring us to the point where charges were supported and legal proceedings began to take a firmer shape. This transition can feel like a change in weather. The investigative file, full of movement and questions, gives way to filings that seek to state the case in a way the court can receive. The language becomes more deliberate. The stakes become formal. The evidence becomes organized for presentation. You can imagine a prosecutor's office, with boxes stacked near a desk, the lids slightly bowed, sticky notes marking important passages. Someone reads a statement again, then places it beside a transaction record. Someone checks the spelling of a name, the date of an interview, the chain for an item. In a serious case, preparation is not a performance. It is a duty to make the truth as clear and accurate as possible. In the Spearfish case, that preparation had to account for multiple defendants and complicated facts. The legal process had to sort responsibility, evaluate evidence, and consider statements that connected the men to Chester's disappearance and death. We keep the wording calm because precision matters here. It is enough to know that Page, Piper, and Hoadley were brought into the case through the accumulated force of evidence and admissions, and that the courts ultimately found them responsible. Court testimony can give evidence a second life. A bank record that once sat quietly in a file may be explained aloud. A piece of property may be identified. A vehicle's movements may be placed on the record. The words spoken in court become part of the case's official memory. You can almost hear the soft echo of a voice in a courtroom. The shuffle of paper after each answer. The stillness that follows a significant fact. That stillness is not suspense in our telling. It is respect. It is the room understanding that ordinary words can carry heavy meaning. In the Spearfish case, the evidence did not need theatrical language. It needed clarity. It needed someone to say what was found, where it was found, when it was recorded, and how it connected. The strength lay in the plainness. Plainness can be a mercy. It keeps us from making spectacle out of sorrow. It lets us talk about the work without turning the people into characters. Chester remains Chester. The investigators remain workers in a difficult field. The family remains a family, not an audience for a mystery. The evidence remains evidence, not props. When we read this way, the case can be held without being made harsher. As the court process moved on, the legal consequences became part of the public record. Sentences were imposed, reviewed, and discussed across years. Those later developments belong to the case, but they do not change the quiet central truth that the evidence had already done its patient work. It had helped identify responsibility. It had helped support convictions. It had helped carry the case from unanswered questions into the formal language of judgment. Judgment, in law, is a heavy word. It means more than opinion. It means the state has examined the evidence and reached a decision with consequence. In the Spearfish case, those decisions had long shadows. They affected the men convicted. They affected Chester's family. They affected the community's memory of what happened. The evidence, once strange and scattered, became part of those shadows. You may feel the weight of that as the file grows older in your hands. The paper is not fresh now. The case has moved through time. People who first read the reports have aged. Some may have retired. Some may have passed the story to younger officers, younger lawyers, younger readers. The Spearfish case remains because records remain, and because the people connected to Chester had reason to remember. Memory and record are not the same. Memory is warm, shifting, vulnerable. Record is cooler, more fixed, and sometimes incomplete in a different way. Together, they help a community keep hold of the past. In this case, the record preserves the evidence that solved it, while memory preserves the human meaning of why solving it mattered. We sit between those two forms of remembering tonight. That is why our pace stays slow. A case like this should not be skimmed only for its odd details. The weird evidence is meaningful because of the patient human work around it. Without the investigators, the card is just plastic. Without the family's identification and concern, the property is just property. Without the courts, the evidence remains only an investigative file. Each piece needs the others to become part of justice. Justice is another word we use carefully. It does not mean everything is repaired. It means the legal system has done what it can within its limits. In the Spearfish case, justice took the form of convictions and sentences, but the family's loss remained larger than the courtroom could contain. You can hold that truth gently. It is not a contradiction. It is the nature of serious cases. The next pages may describe motions, reviews, and appeals, and those documents can seem distant from the original evidence. Yet, the original evidence is still underneath them. Legal arguments may rise around procedure, sentencing, or constitutional questions, but the factual foundation remains tied to the investigation. The card, the blazer, the property, the statements, and the timeline remain in the floorboards of the case, even when later documents speak in more abstract terms. You can imagine reading a later court opinion and suddenly finding a reference back to those early facts. It is like seeing the first road again after traveling for miles. The formal language drops you briefly back into Spearfish, back to Chester, back to the objects and movements that began the case's clarity. That return can be startling, but we let it be quiet. It reminds us that legal history is always attached to lived events. As we keep moving, the file invites us to think about why certain evidence feels weird at all. It is not because bank cards and vehicles are unusual. It is because they cross the boundary between ordinary life and investigation. A thing becomes strange when it appears where love and routine say it should not be. Chester's card should not have been used in that context. His property should not have moved that way. His vehicle should not have traveled without him returning. Those wrong placements gave investigators places to begin. Wrongness can be a guide when it is handled carefully. You do not leap from wrongness to answer. You ask what kind of wrongness it is. A mistake, a misunderstanding, a coincidence, a clue. In the Spearfish case, the repeated wrong placements became evidence of something more structured, and that structure pointed investigators toward the people responsible. You may notice that this kind of reasoning requires both skepticism and openness. Too much skepticism, and every detail is dismissed. Too much openness, and every detail seems meaningful. The investigator has to move between them. In the Spearfish case, the useful details were neither ignored nor inflated. They were tested. That is what allowed them to become part of a reliable account. Testing takes time. It may require another interview, another search, another call to a bank, another drive to check a location, another review of a statement. Each step may feel small, and some steps may produce nothing. But the steps that do produce something are only possible because someone was willing to take them. This is the patience we keep returning to, not passive waiting, but active, careful returning. The case also shows how technology and old-fashioned work can sit side by side. An ATM record gives a machine-made fact. A vehicle sighting may come through human observation. Property identification may require family knowledge. A confession or statement requires interpersonal skill. The Spearfish case was solved by the combination, not by one tool replacing all others. That balance gives the file a grounded feeling. You can think of the investigation as a quiet conversation between different kinds of knowing. The machine says a card was used. The family says an item belonged to Chester. A witness says a person was seen with something. The suspect says a version of events. The investigator listens to all of it and asks which parts can stand together. Where they stand together, the case strengthens. Where they do not, new questions appear. This is why the file has depth. It is not one flat fact repeated. It is layered. Financial data lies beside physical property. Geography lies beside testimony. Family memory lies beside official records. Court findings lie beside investigative notes. Each layer has its own texture, and as you rest with the Spearfish case, you can feel how the layers make the final account more substantial. The physical layer may be the easiest to imagine. The weight of keys, if keys were handled. The shape of a card, the closing of a vehicle door. The rough edge of a cardboard box. The ink on a label. The faint chill of an evidence room. These sensory details do not solve anything by themselves, but they keep us close to the reality that investigations are made by hands as well as minds. The record layer is quieter. It smells of paper, toner, and office air. It sounds like printers, phones, file drawers, and the turning of pages. It looks like dates, names, and lines of text arranged with purpose. In the Spearfish case, this layer held the facts steady across time, long after the first urgency faded. Without it, later readers would be left only with fragments. The human layer is the deepest. It includes Chester's family, the people who worried when he did not appear, the officers who took the reports, the investigators who followed the evidence, and the community that learned the truth through a difficult process. It also includes those who were held responsible, because the legal system had to name their actions and decide consequences. A case file contains many lives. Even when one life stands at the center, you may feel how the room grows quieter when we say that. Many lives, one center. The Spearfish case is not a puzzle for its own sake. It is a human record organized around Chester Poage. The evidence solved the case because it helped explain what happened to him, and because it helped the law respond. That is the reason we return to the small objects with such care. The small objects are patient in their way. They wait for interpretation. They do not demand attention. A card can lie in a report until someone asks the right question. A vehicle can be logged until someone traces its route. A possession can sit in an evidence room until someone connects it to the person who should have had it. The Spearfish case teaches that evidence often waits more calmly than people do. People, understandably, need answers. Families need them. Communities need them. Investigators need them too, though their need has to be disciplined by procedure. In the early days of the Spearfish case, that need must have been sharp and unsettled. Over time, as evidence gathered, the need was met not with comfort, but with clarity. Clarity is not gentle by itself. It becomes gentler only when spoken with respect. We can keep speaking with respect as the case moves through the next part of the file. The page beneath your hand may refer to sentencing, or to later review, or to the way the convictions were recorded. These pages can feel far from the house where the case began, but they are part of the same path. The law's path is long. It can move through years while the original facts remain fixed behind it. Years change the way a case is remembered. At first, people remember the uncertainty, then the arrests, then the proceedings. Later, they may remember the case through a phrase, like the Spearfish case, or through the strange evidence that helped solve it. That kind of compression is natural, but tonight we are undoing the compression gently. We are letting the phrase open back into its details. The details are where compassion can live. It is harder to be careless when you have sat with the exactness of a person's name, a town, a date, a vehicle, a family, a record, and a court file. The more specific the case becomes, the less it can be treated as entertainment alone. That is why we linger. The slow pace is not only for sleep, it is also for care. You might imagine the file being handled by someone many years after the case was first solved. Perhaps a researcher, perhaps a young officer learning from older work, perhaps you, tonight, as the detective in the quiet study, turning pages with no need to hurry. The case has already been through courts. The evidence has already done its formal work. Yet reading it still teaches patience. The lesson is not that every case will be solved if people wait long enough. That would be too simple and not fair to the many families whose questions remain open. The lesson is more modest. When evidence is preserved, when ordinary things are taken seriously, and when investigators are willing to compare rather than assume, some cases can move from confusion into truth. The Spearfish case is one of those cases. Even solved cases can keep teaching because they show the shape of attention. Attention is not the same as obsession. It is steadier than that. It looks, records, compares, rests, returns, and looks again. In this file, attention turns strange fragments into legal clarity. The card was attended to. The blazer was attended to. The property was attended to. Chester's absence was attended to. And that may be the most important part. You can let that sentence settle, because it carries the whole reason for the work. A person's absence must be attended to. It must not be left as rumor. It must not be passed over, because the first answers are difficult. In the Spearfish case, attention became the means by which the truth was found. That truth was heavy, but it was no longer hidden. The next document might be another statement, perhaps summarized rather than transcribed, with official phrasing that smooths away the texture of the room. It may say that a person advised, stated, identified, or admitted. Such words are efficient. They do not show the breath before the sentence, the shifting hands, the cold table, or the investigator listening without interrupting. As we read, we can supply only the atmosphere, not extra facts, and keep the record's boundaries intact. Boundaries matter. They keep a retelling from becoming careless. We know the case was solved through accumulated evidence and admissions. We know the ordinary objects played a meaningful role. We know the legal system reached convictions. Beyond that, we do not need to decorate the facts. The file already has enough in it. The quiet study is not a place for invention. It is a place for patient reading. Patient reading also notices what is absent from the record. We do not hear every private grief. We do not see every family conversation. We do not know every thought of every investigator. The file contains what was needed for the case, not everything that was lived. That absence should make us humble. It reminds us that even a solved case is only partly available to later readers. Humility is important when handling true cases. It keeps the voice low. It keeps the attention on what can be known. It keeps Chester at the center without pretending to know the whole of him from the case file alone. A person is always more than the worst thing connected to their name. The Spearfish case gives us a legal and investigative record, but Chester's life was larger than that record. You might imagine then that somewhere outside the file are photographs that do not belong to court, memories that do not need to be evidence, and stories family members keep because they are about life before the case. Those things matter too, even if they are not part of tonight's investigation. They remind us that the file is only one doorway into a person's life. We step through it carefully and do not claim more than it offers. The evidence, by contrast, asks to be examined for a particular purpose. It asks what happened, who was responsible, and how the facts can be shown. In the Spearfish case, it served that purpose. The weirdness of the evidence was not its final meaning. Its final meaning was usefulness. It helped investigators and courts move from uncertainty to a record that could be acted upon. Usefulness can be a quiet form of dignity. A small object, properly understood, can help name the truth. A line in a bank record can support a family's need for answers. A vehicle's movement can reveal more than the person driving it intended. A recovered possession can connect the official story back to the person whose life was disrupted. These are modest tools, but they can carry great weight. You turn the page again, and the imagined file makes that soft rubbing sound of paper over paper. Outside the circle of the lamp, the room is still. We are now far into the Spearfish case. Far enough that the major pieces have been introduced, but not so far that we need to rush toward any ending. There is still value in staying with how the pieces fit, because fitting is where the work became visible. The fit between evidence and statement is particularly important. If a statement says one thing and the physical record says another, investigators have to decide whether the difference is innocent, mistaken, or significant. That decision cannot be made once and for all in a single moment. It has to be tested. In the Spearfish case, the statements that ultimately mattered did so because they could be measured against things outside the speakers. Outside evidence keeps a case from becoming merely a contest of voices. This is especially important when the facts are serious and emotions are high. A bank record does not become anxious. A property list does not try to persuade. A vehicle report does not change its tone depending on who reads it. These things are limited, but within their limits they can be steady. Investigators need steadiness. The family needed steadiness too, not in the sense that anything could make the loss easy, but in the sense that truthful answers are steadier than rumor. The Spearfish case gave them answers through difficult means, and those answers came with legal action. We keep returning to the evidence because it was the bridge between private fear and public accountability. Without that bridge, the case would have remained a darker uncertainty. You can feel the bridge beneath the file's pages. Each page is a board laid across the gap. A witness statement, a bank record, a vehicle report, a property inventory, a court filing. None is the whole bridge by itself. Together, they allow the case to cross from what was suspected to what could be proven. This is the slow engineering of justice, built from ordinary materials. There is no need to make that engineering loud. The quiet is part of its nature. Detectives do much of their work in low rooms, not on bright stages. Prosecutors prepare in offices, not in dramatic flashes. Clerks stamp and file. Judges read, families wait. The Spearfish case passed through all of those ordinary places, and each place left its small imprint on the outcome. You may imagine the clerk's stamp as a dull, firm sound on paper. The date appears. The document becomes part of the court's memory. Another copy goes into another file. Someone slides it into a folder, and the folder joins the stack. This is how a case becomes durable in the legal sense, not through emotion alone, but through repeated acts of official care. Official care can never replace personal care, but it can support it. It can say that the loss was recognized by the community, by the court, and by the record. In the Spearfish case, the convictions made that recognition formal. The evidence that began as strange fragments became part of that formal recognition. A bank card, a vehicle, and property were no longer just things. They had become instruments of memory. The phrase "instruments of memory" feels gentle enough to keep. Evidence remembers differently than people do, but it remembers. It remembers because people make it remember through collection, preservation, and documentation. An untouched object does not become evidence until someone sees its relevance and protects it. In the Spearfish case, the relevance of ordinary things was recognized, and that recognition helped bring the case to resolution. As we continue, the file gives us another reason to respect ordinary details. They can resist denial. A person may try to explain away one detail, but a network of details can be harder to move. The network in the Spearfish case included the card, vehicle, possessions, statements, travel, and legal admissions. It was not a single thread easily cut. It was woven enough to hold. Woven evidence has a particular strength. Pull one strand, and others show the tension. Ask about the card, and the vehicle appears. Ask about the property, and the statement appears. Ask about the route, and the timing appears. You can see how investigators would move through that weaving, not ripping at it, but following each strand until the larger pattern could be seen. The pattern, once seen, still had to be presented. Presentation is its own skill. Too much detail can confuse. Too little can weaken the case. The work is to tell the truth in an order that makes sense without simplifying it beyond recognition. In the Spearfish case, prosecutors and investigators had to help the court understand how the odd evidence connected and why those connections were strong enough to support responsibility. You can imagine a chart or sequence prepared for trial, with times and events placed carefully. It may not have looked beautiful. It may have been practical, clear, and plain. That is often what serious evidence needs. A beautiful presentation is less important than an accurate one. The facts have their own gravity, and the task is to let that gravity be felt without distortion. Distortion is what we avoid tonight as well. We do not turn the case into a riddle solved by a single clever twist. We do not pretend the evidence was charming because it was unusual. We keep the sorrow visible and the method visible. The Spearfish case was solved by patient detective work, and the weird evidence was meaningful because it led to truth in a case where truth mattered deeply. The room around our imagined desk has become very quiet now, the kind of quiet where paper sounds louder than it should. You might hear your own breathing as the next page turns. This is the right pace for the case. Slow enough to notice the texture, slow enough to remember Chester's name, slow enough to understand that a solved case can still ask for gentleness. The gentleness is not avoidance. It is a way of looking steadily without adding harm. We can acknowledge convictions, evidence, and responsibility while keeping our language soft. We can say that Page, Piper, and Hoadley were held accountable without retelling the painful details in a way that serves no purpose here. The file contains those facts, but tonight our focus remains on how the investigation found its way. Finding the way required people to trust the small facts. That can be hard when a case feels overwhelming. A small fact may feel inadequate beside a large loss. But small facts are often all investigators have at first. They collect them anyway. They protect them anyway. In the Spearfish case, those small facts were not inadequate. They were the beginning of accountability. You can think of a small fact as a match struck in a large dark room. It does not light everything. It shows one chair, one wall, one doorway. Then another match is struck, and another. Eventually, the room is not fully bright, but it is navigable. The Spearfish case was made navigable by those small illuminations, each one handled carefully before it went out. The bank card was one illumination. The blazer was another. The property was another. The statements were another. The legal documents that followed were later lamps placed along the same path. As we sit with them, the case becomes less about strangeness and more about continuity. One careful act leads to the next, and the next act preserves what the previous one found. Continuity is one of the quiet gifts of a good investigation. It means someone else can pick up the file and see what happened. It means a prosecutor can understand the detective's work. It means a judge can understand the prosecutor's argument. It means future readers can understand why the case was considered solved. In the Spearfish case, continuity helped ordinary evidence become durable truth. Durable truth is a sober phrase. It does not mean a truth that feels good. It means a truth that can hold its shape through time, review, and retelling. The Spearfish case needed that kind of truth because the loss at its center was profound. The evidence had to carry more than curiosity. It had to carry consequence, and it did so by being gathered, tested, and placed in order. You can feel how the order steadies the file. First concern, first reports, evidence gathered, records checked, statements taken, connections made, arrests, court, review. The actual case may have had more turns than this simple line can show. But the broad movement is clear. What began as absence became investigation, and what investigation found became legal record. The legal record, in turn, became public memory. People who never knew Chester may know the Spearfish case because of the unusual evidence that helped solve it. That is an imperfect kind of remembrance, but it can still carry respect if told carefully. We can make sure the evidence does not overshadow him. We can let it point back to him where it belongs. You may notice the lamp again in this imagined study. It has been burning for a long time now. The shade is warm to the touch, though you do not touch it. The file is still open. The paper has a faint, dry smell. Outside the room, the night continues without needing anything from us. We keep reading because the case still has more patience to teach. The next section turns, not sharply, but gradually, toward the way investigators must handle confidence. Too little confidence, and a case cannot move forward. Too much, and it may move wrongly. In the Spearfish case, confidence grew from corroboration. The investigators could become more certain because different forms of evidence kept supporting the same general account. That is a steadier kind of confidence than instinct alone. Instinct may begin an inquiry, but corroboration carries it. A detective may feel that a story is wrong, but feeling is not enough. The feeling must be given work to do. It must send the detective back to records, objects, and witnesses. In the Spearfish case, whatever suspicions emerged had to pass through that work. The odd evidence was useful because it allowed suspicion to become supported fact. Supported fact has a quiet dignity. It stands without insisting. It does not need dramatic music. It can be written on a page and still matter. A transaction happened. A vehicle moved. An item was found or identified. A statement was given. A court reached a finding. These sentences are plain, and their plainness is part of their strength. The Spearfish case rests on that kind of plain strength. There is also a lesson here about how evidence can outlast the people's first reactions to it. At first, A detail may seem minor or confusing. Later, it becomes central. At first, a possession may seem like one more missing item. Later, it becomes part of a pattern. At first, a route may seem like travel. Later, it becomes a bridge between people, places, and responsibility. You can hold that lesson gently as the page turns. It means investigators must treat early details with respect, even before they know what the details will become. It means they must resist discarding things too quickly. It means the file has to remain open enough for meaning to develop. In the Spearfish case, the meaning developed through steady attention, and the case became clearer because people did not rush past the plain clues. Plain clues are easy to underestimate. They do not glitter. They do not announce themselves. They wait in logs, receipts, statements, and property lists. But they can become decisive when they are connected correctly. The Spearfish case reminds us that weird evidence is often weird only because we have finally noticed how far an ordinary thing has traveled from where it belongs. That is true of the card. It traveled from being a personal object to being a financial record to being investigative evidence. It moved through categories without moving physically very much at all. Its meaning changed because the circumstances around it changed. The same can be said for the vehicle and the belongings. They did not become important because they were unusual objects. They became important because they were tied to Chester and then appeared in a pattern that required explanation. Explanation is the word at the heart of this section. Investigators ask for explanations. Courts evaluate explanation. Families live with the explanation that survives the evidence. In the Spearfish case, the final explanation was not gentle, but it was supported. It gave shape to what had happened, and in doing so, it gave the legal system a way to respond. You may feel tired now in the intended way, as the details move in a slow circle around the same center. That is all right. The repetition is part of the quiet. If your eyes drift, the case will still be here when they open again. You may hear the name Spearfish, the name Chester Poage, and know where we are in the file. We are still with the evidence, still following the patient work. The next pages continue to breathe with that work, and we move into them softly, carrying forward the card, the blazer, the belongings, and the steady thought that even the strangest clue becomes useful only when someone takes the time to understand it. The next pages continue to breathe with that work, and we move into them softly, carrying forward the card, the blazer, the belongings, and the steady thought that even the strangest clue becomes useful only when someone takes the time to understand it. You can feel the case settling into its own rhythm now. A rhythm of checking, returning, and checking again. The Spearfish case does not ask us to hurry. It asks us to keep our place in the file, one careful page at a time. A case file has a way of making time visible. At first, the dates appear as simple markers. The 12th of March, the days after, the first interviews, the first efforts to trace what had moved. Then the dates begin to feel like small doors. Behind each one is a room of activity, some of it recorded, some of it only implied. You can imagine stepping through those doors slowly, hearing the soft change in the air as the investigation moves from one day into the next. The early days of the Spearfish case were the days when every answer still had to be earned. A missing young man, a vehicle out of place, a card being used, belongings disturbed, and people whose accounts had to be understood. None of that would have arranged itself without deliberate attention. We can picture an investigator looking at the clock, then back at the notes, knowing that time matters, but also knowing that pressure must not become carelessness. Carelessness is dangerous in any case, and especially in one where ordinary evidence is doing such important work. A wrong date can weaken a timeline. A mislabeled item can create confusion. A vague statement can leave room where clarity should have been. In the Spearfish case, the strength came from keeping these small matters steady. You can feel how much responsibility sits inside a simple line of typed text. The official documents may not show the hands that made them, but we can imagine those hands. One person types the report, another initials an evidence seal, another files a request, another answers a phone. Each task seems small, and yet the case depends on the tasks being done correctly. That is the nature of patient detective work. It is built from small, responsible actions, repeated until the truth has enough structure to stand. When you read about the bank card, you may pause over how thin the line is between routine and evidence. In another life, the card would only have belonged to daily errands. Cash for fuel, cash for food, cash for an ordinary purchase. But in the Spearfish case, ordinary use became impossible to read innocently once Chester was gone. The card's record became a quiet witness to an absence no one could explain away. Absence is one of the hardest things in a file. It is not like an object you can hold. It is a shape made by what should be present and is not. Chester should have been able to speak for himself. He should have been able to explain where he had gone, who had his card, and why his vehicle moved. Because he could not, the evidence had to carry a portion of that burden. You can imagine the investigators feeling that burden without naming it in the report. Reports are not made for emotion. They are made for facts, but the people writing them are still human. They would have understood that every recorded clue existed because a family was waiting and because a young man's life had been taken out of its proper course. The Spearfish case kept that human pressure beneath its formal language. The vehicle gives us another kind of absence. A car or truck without its owner can feel strangely vacant. The seat may still hold the shape of use. The mirrors may be angled for familiar eyes. The keys may belong to habits known only to one person. In the Spearfish case, Chester's blazer became important not only because it moved, but because its movement separated it from the person who should have controlled it. That separation was a fact investigators could follow. Following a vehicle can mean many things. It can mean asking who last saw it, who drove it, where it was found, whether anyone tried to sell it, hide it, abandon it, or use it as if it were theirs. It can mean matching locations against statements, and statements against other statements. You can picture a map with pencil marks, not dramatic arrows, but small, careful notes at the edges of towns and roads. The map becomes part of the file's memory. Maps are helpful because they keep us honest about distance. A person can say something happened quickly, but a map may show that travel would have taken longer. A person can claim not to have been near a place, while a vehicle or witness suggests otherwise. In the Spearfish case, geography helped contain the story. The wide space around the Black Hills became not emptiness, but a surface on which movement could be read. There is a sensory calm in thinking of those roads at night. Cold air presses at the glass. Headlights pass over mile markers, road signs, pale grass, and dark stands of pine. The heater clicks and hums. The tires make a steady sound that can almost lull the mind. But in the file, those roads are not abstract scenery. They are the paths along which evidence traveled. The belongings, by contrast, bring the case back indoors. They return us to rooms, shelves, drawers, and the intimacy of ownership. When someone's property appears outside its rightful setting, investigators ask practical questions. But families may feel something much deeper. They recognize what an item meant in daily life. They know whether it would have been lent, sold, misplaced, or kept close. That knowledge can be evidence too, when handled with care. You can imagine a family member identifying an item in a quiet room. The object may look ordinary to everyone else. To them, it may carry 1,000 small associations. The file may record only the identification, but the moment itself would have been heavier than that. In the Spearfish case, property evidence helped connect the investigation back to Chester's lived world, the world that existed before the file was opened. That is one of the reasons we keep our language gentle. Evidence is not neutral to those who loved the person at the center. A list of items may be a document to the court, but it may be memory to the family. A vehicle may be transportation to one reader, but familiar presence to another. A bank card may be data, but also a sign of daily independence. In the Spearfish case, those layers all existed together. The investigator has to move among those layers without losing focus. Compassion matters, but so does precision. A family's identification must be documented. An emotional observation must be translated into a fact the case can use. That translation can feel cold, but it is necessary. It allows private knowledge to enter the public record without losing its purpose. You can see the difficulty of that work and the care it requires. As the file moves toward the interviews, the sound in the room changes again. The rustle of property lists gives way to voices, or at least to the written trace of voices. A transcript or report may show what someone said, but not how long they looked down before saying it. It may show an answer, but not the quiet between questions. You can feel those unrecorded silences around the margins. In the Spearfish case, those interviews mattered because they brought human accounts into contact with the evidence. Investigators could ask about the card. They could ask about the blazer. They could ask about belongings, routes, and timing. Every answer could then be placed beside what was already known. This is where the case begins to feel less like a search through fog and more like a careful assembling of a clock. A clock is useful because each part must fit the next. If one gear is out of place, the movement falters. Timelines work similarly. The time of one transaction must fit the location of a vehicle. The location of a vehicle must fit a statement. The statement must fit what another person says or what an object shows. In the Spearfish case, the odd evidence helped set the gears in relation to one another. You can almost hear that clock ticking in the interview room. Not loudly, not with suspense, but quietly on the wall while a detective asks the next question. The room smells faintly of warmed plastic, paper, and a jacket damp from outside air. A recorder sits between people. The table is plain. The chairs are practical. Nothing in the room looks like history, though history is being made there in small, recorded steps. When an admission enters a case, it does not float alone. It has to be understood alongside the evidence that came before it and the evidence that may come after. In the Spearfish case, statements and admissions formed part of the path to conviction, but they were strongest because they were not isolated from the physical and financial facts. They fit into a structure that had already begun to rise. Fit is the quiet word we keep finding. The card fit the timeline. The vehicle fit the movement. The property fit possession and conduct. Statements fit or failed to fit until the stronger account emerged. This kind of fit is not decorative. It is the way investigators protect a case from guesswork. You can feel the care in it, and that care is why the evidence could travel into court. Court changes the case's atmosphere, but not its center. The center remains Chester Poage and the evidence that explained his absence. In court, the facts had to be spoken with formality. Attorneys had to ask questions. Witnesses had to answer. Judges had to rule. Documents had to be entered. The ordinary pieces we have been holding in our minds were carried into a public space and given official weight. You can picture the courtroom on a morning when the light is pale through high windows, and people speak more softly than usual because the room asks for it. Papers lie in neat stacks. A microphone waits. The benches are hard. Shoes sound different on the floor than they do in an office hallway. Somewhere in that formality, the Spearfish case moved from investigation into judgment, and the evidence had to remain steady. For the family, court may have felt both necessary and exhausting. The same facts had to be heard again, and the same names repeated. The law requires that, but requirement does not make it easy. We can imagine the emotional fatigue without intruding on it. We can simply say that the process asked much from those who already had lost much, and that the evidence served as the means by which the process could move. The men convicted in the Spearfish case, Elijah Page, Briley Piper, and Darrell Hoadley, became part of that public record in different ways as proceedings unfolded. Their names appear in relation to charges, convictions, sentences, and later reviews. We speak them plainly because the file does. We do not need to dwell on punishment tonight beyond recognizing that the legal system reached serious consequences after the evidence and statements were considered. Consequences are another kind of record. They tell the community that the case was not left unanswered. They tell future readers that evidence was gathered, evaluated, and accepted as proof of responsibility. In the Spearfish case, those consequences followed from the patient accumulation we have been tracing. They did not come from one strange clue alone. They came from the whole patient body of work. That body of work is why the case can be revisited years later with a focus on evidence rather than only on outcome. Outcome is important, but method is instructive. It shows how investigators made their way through uncertainty. It shows how ordinary objects can become significant when their context changes. It shows how records created by machines and memories offered by people can be brought together into one account. You can rest with that for a moment, because it is the central craft of the investigation. Bring things together. Do not force them. Do not leave them isolated. Let the card speak to the vehicle speak to the route speak to the statement speak to the property, and the property speak back to Chester's ordinary life. That is how the Spearfish case became understandable. The word understandable does not mean acceptable. It means that the facts could be arranged into an account. There is a difference, and the difference matters. A case can be solved without becoming less sad. A case can be legally clear and still emotionally difficult. The Spearfish case belongs to that category, and our calm attention should never turn clarity into comfort too quickly. Still, clarity has a place. It prevents the story from dissolving into uncertainty. It gives the family and the public something firmer than rumor. It allows courts to act. It allows the file, years later, to show its work. You can imagine opening the folder and seeing not just a conclusion, but the path toward it, page by page, each one carrying a little more of the weight. The path includes the first investigators who understood that property mattered. It includes whoever obtained and reviewed the bank records. It includes the officers who tracked the vehicle and the people connected to it. It includes the interviewers who listened long enough for accounts to take shape. It includes the people who prepared evidence for court. The Spearfish case was solved through a network of such efforts, each one modest and necessary. Networks can be difficult to see because no single point explains everything. But a network is exactly what serious evidence often becomes. It connects. It supports. It distributes weight. If one witness cannot remember everything, a record may help. If one record is limited, an object may support it. If one object raises a question, a statement may answer it. In this case, the network held. You might imagine that network laid over a map of Spearfish and the surrounding region. Delicate lines crossing roads, houses, offices, and courtrooms. One line goes to the bank. One line goes to the vehicle. One line goes to the property. One line goes to the interview room. One line goes to the courtroom. At the center of all those lines is Chester, not as a puzzle piece, but as the person whose absence made the lines necessary. The longer we sit with the file, the more the ordinary evidence seems less weird and more quietly inevitable. Of course, a bank card matters when the cardholder is missing. Of course, a vehicle matters when it moves without its owner returning. Of course, belongings matter when they appear outside the ordinary pattern of a life. The weirdness is only the first impression. Careful reading turns weirdness into relevance. Relevance is not automatic. Investigators have to establish it. They have to show why an item matters, not merely that it exists. In the Spearfish case, relevance came from connection. The card connected to timing and access. The blazer connected to movement and possession. The belongings connected to Chester's home and the conduct of others. Each connection had to be strong enough to endure questions. You can hear those questions being prepared before court. How do we know this item belonged to him? How do we know who used the card? How do we know where the vehicle traveled? How do we know the statement is reliable? The work of prosecution is partly the work of anticipating such questions and answering them with evidence. The work of investigation, done earlier, makes those answers possible. It is calming, in a sober way, to see how much truth depends on preparation. Preparation is slow, it is often invisible, it rarely appears in retellings except as a finished result. But without it, the strangest evidence cannot help. A strange fact poorly preserved may become confusion. A strange fact carefully prepared may become proof. In the Spearfish case, preparation allowed odd details to carry meaning. The file's texture changes again when we think about appeals. Appeals are made of arguments rather than field notes. They are written in structured language, often far from the sensory world of roads, rooms, and objects. Yet they are still connected to those earlier facts. The appellate record is like a distant echo of the original investigation, cleaner in form, but still shaped by what was collected on the ground. You can imagine a judge reading briefs years after the first reports, perhaps in an office lined with books, the pages marked with tabs, the language careful and formal. The judge is not walking through Spearfish. The judge is not holding the bank card. The judge is reading the record that others created. This is why the earlier documentation matters so much. It allows people far removed from the first days to understand what happened well enough to decide legal questions. Distance in time can either weaken or strengthen a case's memory. If the record is poor, distance makes things fade. If the record is strong, distance allows the case to remain clear even after many years. The Spearfish case, because it was solved and litigated, left records that could be read later. Those records keep the odd evidence from becoming only folklore. They keep it tied to names, dates, and legal findings. Folklore simplifies, files complicate. A phrase like weird evidence that solved the Spearfish case is easy to remember, but the file asks for patience with the actual path. It asks us to slow the phrase down until we can see the card, the vehicle, the belongings, the interviews, the court, and the years of aftermath. That slowing is what we are doing tonight, and it is the reason the story can remain calm. The calm does not erase the seriousness. It gives seriousness room to be understood. We can speak of a solved case without making it triumphant. We can speak of evidence without making it thrilling. We can speak of courts without making the process feel neat. The Spearfish case is serious because a young man's life was lost and because other people were held responsible. The calm is our way of honoring that seriousness without adding spectacle. You may notice how often the file brings us back to responsibility. Investigators are responsible for accuracy. Prosecutors are responsible for presentation. Courts are responsible for judgment. Families are burdened with memory, though that burden is not something they chose. Even later readers have a kind of responsibility to speak carefully and not make the case smaller than it was. We share that responsibility as we keep turning the pages. The sensory world of later reading is gentler than the original work must have been. We sit with the case at a distance. The lamp is soft. The paper is dry. The danger has passed into record. But distance should not make us careless. It should make us more deliberate. We have the benefit of knowing the case was solved. And that knowledge lets us examine how the evidence worked, without pretending we are inside the first uncertainty. Inside the first uncertainty, everything would have felt less organized. The card record may not have been immediately available. The vehicle's meaning may not have been fully understood. The property list may have been incomplete at first. The statements may have shifted as people were located and questioned. The Spearfish case, like many investigations, likely felt more fragmented in motion than it looks in hindsight. Hindsight smooths the path. It hides the false starts and the waiting. It makes the important details look as if they were always important. We can resist that smoothing by remembering the investigators' actual position. They had to decide in real time which leads to follow, which records to request, and which accounts required closer attention. They had to work without the comfort we have now, the comfort of knowing that the case reached convictions. That is why patience is not just an aesthetic choice in this retelling. It is true to the work. The Spearfish case was not clarified by dramatic instinct. It was clarified by the slow joining of evidence. We let the prose move slowly because the work moved carefully. The rhythm of the telling should match the rhythm of the investigation, with enough space between details for each one to settle. A quiet detail can be more memorable when it has space around it. The bank machine in artificial light, the blazer moving through cold air, the evidence bag on a metal shelf, the interview room with its plain table, the courtroom with papers arranged in order. These images do not need intensity. They need stillness. In stillness, we can see how ordinary spaces become part of extraordinary responsibility. You can almost place your hand on the map again. Spearfish is a dot, but also a community. Roads move away from it and return. The Black Hills rise nearby, old and patient in their own way. The case belongs to that geography, and the geography gives it texture. It is not a mystery floating in empty space. It happened in a place where people lived, knew each other, drove familiar roads, and expected ordinary days to remain ordinary. When ordinary days are broken, evidence often begins with the things closest to hand. A missing person's vehicle, a card, a room, a last known movement, a familiar contact. Detectives start there because that is where life leaves its nearest traces. In the Spearfish case, those nearest traces widened into a larger investigation, but the beginning remained close to Chester's everyday world. Everyday worlds are made of repetition, the same keys, the same roads, the same bank card, the same belongings placed in familiar spots. Investigators notice disruption because they first try to understand routine. What would Chester normally do? Where would he normally be? Who would normally have access to his things? When routine is understood, disruption becomes visible. The Spearfish case depended on seeing that disruption clearly. Routine can be a form of evidence, though it is softer than a receipt. Family and friends know routine. They know what feels like someone and what does not. They know whether a silence is normal, whether a missing vehicle is expected, whether a card use makes sense. Their knowledge may begin as concern, but investigators can turn parts of it into documented fact. That transition from concern to evidence is delicate and important. You can picture the first conversations with people who cared about Chester. The questions may have been practical, but the answers would have carried emotion. When did you last see him? Did he have plans? Who was he with? What vehicle was he driving? Did he usually carry this card? What belongings are missing? Such questions can feel intrusive, but they are how a case begins to gather shape. The people answering those questions may not know which detail will matter. They give what they can: a time, a memory, a description, a small correction. Later, one of those details may become important because it touches the bank record or the property list. The Spearfish case reminds us that witnesses and family members often provide pieces without knowing where they will fit. Investigators have to keep those pieces safe until the fit appears. Safekeeping is a recurring theme. Keep the object safe. Keep the record safe. Keep the statement accurate. Keep the timeline open but orderly. Keep the victim's name central. Keep the legal process anchored in proof. In the Spearfish case, safekeeping transformed vulnerable details into durable evidence. It is a quiet, almost domestic kind of care, applied to a deeply serious purpose. There is something moving about that. The same human impulse that folds a letter carefully or places a photograph in a drawer can also appear in evidence work, though in a more formal shape. Label the bag, seal the envelope, store the file, preserve the receipt, make the copy, check the date. Care is not always soft in appearance. Sometimes it looks like procedure. Procedure can be comforting when it is done well. It gives people a path through moments that would otherwise be chaotic. The Spearfish case moved through procedures of investigation, charging, trial, sentencing, and review. Each stage had its own rules. Those rules did not erase sorrow, but they gave the facts a way to be handled without being lost to panic or anger. You may feel the pace of the case changing as it moves through those stages. Investigation has a searching rhythm. Court has an ordered rhythm. Appeals have a written rhythm. Memory has no fixed rhythm at all. The Spearfish case contains all of these. Our narration moves among them like a slow hand over different textures: rough report paper, smooth court pages, soft family memory, and the dry edges of archive folders. The archive folder is where the case rests now for our purposes tonight. Solved, recorded, and still capable of teaching. You open it not to change the outcome, but to understand the method. You are the detective in the quiet room, though the real detectives did their work long ago. You are tracing their reasoning by lamplight, letting the evidence show you why the answer became clear. Tracing reasoning is different from reliving events. It keeps us at a respectful distance. We do not need to imagine the harm. We imagine the work that responded to it. The Spearfish case becomes bearable in this format because we focus on the effort to understand, the care taken with evidence, and the long passage from uncertainty to proof. That focus lets the listener rest without feeling abandoned in darkness. The next page may show a short entry that seems minor. A time a call was made. A place someone was seen. A note that an item was recovered. It is tempting to pass over such entries quickly, but tonight we do not. We let the small entry stay visible for a moment. Many cases turn on small entries like that because they provide the connective tissue between larger facts. Connective tissue is not dramatic, but it is necessary. A case made only of big moments would fall apart. It needs the little confirmations, the records that prove timing, the notes that explain sequence, the identifications that establish ownership. In the Spearfish case, the strange evidence mattered because the connective tissue held it together. Without that tissue, the card, vehicle, and property might have remained separate oddities. Separate oddities invite speculation. Connected evidence invites judgment. That distinction is important. Speculation can drift endlessly. Judgment requires structure. Investigators in the Spearfish case were not simply noticing odd details. They were connecting them until the legal system could judge what they meant. You can feel the patience in that movement from noticing to connecting to presenting. The presenting must have required careful choices. What to emphasize, what order to use, which witness could explain which fact, which document established which point, how to avoid confusing the listener with too many details while still showing the whole path. These choices matter because a courtroom, like a sleepy listener, needs to be guided through information in an order that can be followed. Guidance is part of our role tonight too. We return gently to the case name, to Chester's name, to the key evidence, so that if your mind drifts and returns, you know where you are. We are in the Spearfish case. We are with the weird evidence that helped solve it. We are watching ordinary objects become meaningful through patient work. Nothing needs to be solved by you tonight. The solving has already happened, and we are only reading how. That difference allows the tone to remain calm. We are not chasing an answer, we are tracing one. Tracing is quieter. It lets the hand move slowly along a line already drawn. It lets us notice the texture of the paper, the slight shadow of old ink, the way one fact rests against another. The Spearfish case is a line we can trace carefully, with respect for the person at its center. You can think again of Chester's name at the top of the file. The name is not evidence in the same way the card is, but it is the reason evidence matters. It keeps the file from becoming abstract. Every time the investigation lists an object or a date, that object or date belongs to the effort to answer what happened to him. The name is the anchor that prevents the evidence from drifting into mere curiosity. Anchors are important in long stories. They keep us oriented. The Spearfish case has several anchors, but Chester's name is the deepest one. Spearfish is the place anchor. The bank card is a clue anchor. The blazer is a movement anchor. The property is a human anchor. The court record is an outcome anchor. Together, they keep the case steady as we move through its many pages. The page beneath us now feels like it might contain later reflections on how the case was remembered. Not a conclusion, not yet, but a widening of perspective. Over time, people may look back and identify the strange evidence as the reason the case stands out. That is natural. Our minds hold unusual details, but the unusual details only deserve attention because they were part of a serious and careful investigation. A strange clue without patient work is only a story fragment. Patient work gives it a role. In the Spearfish case, the role of the odd evidence was to support the path toward accountability. It helped investigators challenge false or incomplete explanations. It helped court proceedings rest on more than words alone. It helped transform absence into a documented account. That is a profound thing for ordinary evidence to do. You can pause and listen to the room again. The lamp hums faintly, or perhaps that is only the quiet pressure of night. The pages lie open. Your fingertips may feel the paper's dry resistance. The case does not rush you. It has already traveled through its years. Tonight, it is content to be read slowly with the patience it once required from those who worked it. In the next portion of the file, the focus may return again to how statements were corroborated. Corroboration is the word that keeps the case from resting on a single point. It means another source supports what has been said. A record supports a memory. An object supports a statement. A timeline supports a route. In the Spearfish case, corroboration made the strange evidence stronger because it showed the evidence was not alone. Being not alone matters in court. It also matters in memory. A family hearing an answer supported by several kinds of evidence may feel a different kind of steadiness than they would from a single uncertain claim. That steadiness does not remove grief, but it can reduce the additional suffering of doubt. In this way, the patient details of the Spearfish case had human value beyond their legal value. Legal value and human value sometimes overlap, though they are not identical. A receipt may be legally useful because it places a card at a time. It may be humanly meaningful because it shows that someone else was using what belonged to Chester after he could no longer explain it. Both values can exist in the same line of text. We read slowly enough to recognize both. The same is true of the blazer. Legally, it helped show movement, possession, and connection. Humanly, it represented a young man's ordinary independence, his ability to move through the world, taken out of its rightful pattern. We do not need to sentimentalize the vehicle to see that. We only need to remember that ordinary belongings become emotionally charged when the person attached to them is gone. The property evidence may have been even more personal. Objects from a home carry the feel of rooms, choices, and daily use. When investigators handle such objects, they are handling pieces of a life. The Spearfish case required that handling to be formal, but formality does not erase meaning. A bag can have a label and still contain something deeply personal. An inventory can be accurate and still be sad. This layered meaning is why the file can be read many years later and still feel alive. Not alive in a sensational way, alive because the human connections have not disappeared. Chester's name still matters. The family's waiting still matters. The investigator's care still matters. The evidence still matters because it performed the quiet work of bringing truth forward. Truth forward is a gentle phrase for a difficult process. The truth does not always come willingly. It may have to be pulled through denial, confusion, fear, and time. The Spearfish case shows that process in practical form. Follow the card, follow the vehicle, follow the belongings, follow the statements. Let the facts come forward because they have been given no place to hide from one another. There is a softness in the way facts can rest together once they have been arranged. Before arrangement, they may feel chaotic. After arrangement, they feel solemn. You can imagine the completed case file closed on a desk after a long day, its pages aligned, its cover worn. The work inside it is not peaceful, but the organization has a kind of calm. It says the disorder was met with attention. Attention is one of the few tools humans have against disorder. We cannot undo what happened. The investigators could not. The courts could not. But attention can prevent a wrong from disappearing into confusion. It can preserve a name. It can identify responsibility. It can give a community a record. In the Spearfish case, attention gave the strange evidence a purpose. You may want to linger with that purpose before moving on. Purpose is what separates evidence from clutter. The world contains endless objects and records, but only some belong to a case. Investigators have to find which ones. In Spearfish, the relevant objects were not glamorous. They were practical and close at hand. Their purpose emerged through connection, and once connected, they helped solve the case. A file like this also teaches that the first description of evidence is often incomplete. An item may enter the report in one role and later take on another. A vehicle may be listed as missing, then tracked, then discussed as part of a route. A card may be listed as property, then as a transaction record, then as a link to behavior. The Spearfish case gives us these changes in meaning, and we follow them without rushing. Following changes in meaning is good work for a quiet mind. It is patient, almost meditative. You watch the same object under different lights. First household light, then investigative light, then courtroom light, then archival light. The object does not change, but its meaning deepens. The bank card, the blazer, and the belongings all pass through those lights in the Spearfish case. Archival light is the softest one. It falls years later, when the immediate work is done and the file is being reopened only for memory, study, or retelling. Under archival light, the evidence is no longer urgent in the same way, but it remains important. It shows how the answer was found. It lets future readers understand the patient steps behind the word solved. It keeps the case from becoming only a headline. Headlines are too small for most lives. Chester's life was larger than the headline of the Spearfish case, and the investigation was larger than the phrase weird evidence. The phrase may bring us to the file, but once we arrive, we owe the file more attention than the phrase alone can hold. We give that attention by slowing down, by naming the objects carefully, and by keeping the human center visible. You turn another page, and it may contain an official summary of evidence. Summaries are useful, but they can feel compressed. They may list the vehicle, the card, the property, the statements, and the outcome in a few lines. We take those lines and let them open. Each one has a room behind it, a person behind it, a task behind it. The Spearfish case becomes fuller when the compressed record is allowed to breathe. Breathing room helps the listener, and it helps the case. It prevents the facts from arriving like hard stones. It lets them settle like papers placed gently on a desk. The card, the blazer, the belongings, the interviews, the court record. Each one lands softly, but each one still has weight. That balance is the tone we keep. The next room behind the summary is the room of investigative decision. Someone had to decide that the card use should be pursued. Someone had to obtain the records. Someone had to match them with other facts. Someone had to ask the uncomfortable question that followed. The Spearfish case was solved because those decisions were made, and because they were made in sequence rather than as isolated gestures. Sequence matters again. A later statement may only become important because an earlier record exists. A recovered object may only become meaningful because a family member identified it. A vehicle's route may only matter because it overlaps with other behavior. In the Spearfish case, sequence turned information into evidence. You can feel the quiet intelligence of that ordering. There is a certain calm in ordered information. The mind can rest because it knows where to place each detail. We are not trying to solve the case from scratch tonight. We are watching how the order was formed. That allows the story to move gently, even though the facts are serious. The file is already arranged. We only turn the pages and notice the care. You may hear distant rain in the imagined room, though perhaps there was none in Spearfish when the first reports were written. The sound belongs to our quiet study, not necessarily to the original investigation. It taps softly at the window while we read. The smell of old paper and lamp heat remains. Your hand rests near the margin. The case waits in patient paragraphs. In the original work, the weather would have been whatever the day gave them. Cold wind, dry road, pale sun, night air, office heat. Investigators work through weather because cases do not pause for comfort. Families wait through weather too. The Spearfish case moved through days and then years, and the weather of those years is mostly absent from the record. But we can imagine the passage of seasons around the court dates and filings. Seasons are one way time becomes visible. Spring into summer, summer into fall, court calendars turning, appeals filed, decisions issued. The first shock of the case slowly becoming a long legal history. In the Spearfish case, time did not erase the evidence, because the evidence had been documented. The card record remained a record. The vehicle information remained in the file. The property evidence remained part of the account. This is why documentation can feel almost defiant. Time tries to blur. Documentation says, here is what was decided. The Spearfish case, preserved in records, resists the blurring that time naturally brings. It keeps the method visible for anyone willing to read slowly. The method is worth seeing because it is neither glamorous nor simple. It is methodical. It asks for steady hands. It asks for skepticism without cruelty. It asks for compassion without loss of precision. It asks investigators to keep going when the first answer is not available. In the Spearfish case, the method worked because evidence from different parts of ordinary life came together. Ordinary life leaves many kinds of traces: financial traces, vehicle traces, social traces, property traces, geographic traces. The investigator's task is to find which traces belong to the case and which belong only to the noise of daily living. That sorting is delicate. In the Spearfish case, the relevant traces were close enough to one another that they formed a coherent path, and the path led to accountability. Coherence is calming to the mind, even when the content is hard. It gives shape. It allows the listener to follow without alarm. The Spearfish case had coherence because the evidence converged. The convergence did not make the story light, but it made it understandable. Understanding is not the same as ease. It is simply a place where the mind can rest from confusion. We can rest there briefly before the next page. The lamp remains warm. The file remains open. The names remain steady. Chester Poash at the center, Spearfish as the place, the card and the blazer as guides, the belongings as personal traces, and the court record as the formal shape of accountability. We hold them not as a summary, but as objects still on the desk, while we continue reading. The following pages seem to invite closer attention to the way a solved case is remembered by those outside it. People may hear the story years later and focus on the unusual evidence first. That is understandable, because unusual evidence is easier to hold in the mind than long procedure. But if we remain only with the unusual, we miss the patience. The Spearfish case deserves the patience. Patience is where the real shape of the investigation lives. It lives in the decision to verify a transaction. It lives in the decision to track property. It lives in the interview that goes slowly enough for an inconsistency to appear. It lives in the prosecutor's preparation and the court's review. It lives in the family's endurance through each stage. Weird evidence may catch attention, but patience is what allowed it to matter. You can feel that distinction as the night deepens. Attention may be caught quickly, but trust is built slowly. The evidence in the Spearfish case became trustworthy because it was handled through a process. That process gave the final account its weight. Without the process, the same details might have remained disturbing fragments. With the process, they became part of a legal truth. The next page, perhaps, contains a note about a recovered item. We do not know the full texture of every item from this distance, but we know what such notes feel like. Plain language, item description, location, date, officer, case number. The note itself may be short, but it represents a chain of action. Someone found it, recognized possible relevance, preserved it, and entered it into the system. There is dignity in that chain. It means the object was not left to vanish. It means the case gained another point of reference. It means a family's loss was being pursued through practical acts. The Spearfish case is filled with such practical acts, and that is why it fits the quiet detective work we are following tonight. The mystery was not met with spectacle, it was met with care. Care, again, looks like procedure. It also looks like returning to a witness with one more question. It looks like reading the same statement after a new record arrives. It looks like noticing that one detail has begun to matter more than it did yesterday. It looks like refusing to assume that ordinary means unimportant. In the Spearfish case, ordinary was where the answer waited. The phrase "where the answer waited" feels right for this portion of the file. The answer waited in records that had to be requested. It waited in objects that had to be identified. It waited in statements that had to be compared. It waited in the relationship between a card, a vehicle, property, and people. The investigators did not create the answer. They uncovered it by staying with the evidence. Uncovering is gentle work when done properly. It is not tearing. It is lifting one layer, then another. A page, a memory, a record, a route. Each layer reveals a little more, and each layer must be handled so it can be placed back if needed. The Spearfish case, read in this way, becomes a lesson in careful uncovering. We can follow it without strain. You may feel the pace slowing even more as we approach another transition in the file. Not an ending, but a turn toward the aftermath of evidence doing its work. Once evidence has helped solve a case, it does not disappear. It continues to exist in the record. It may be cited in appeals, revisited in articles, remembered by investigators, or preserved in archives. Evidence has a long afterlife. The afterlife of evidence is quieter than its active use. During the investigation, an item may be urgent. During trial, it may be central. Years later, it may rest in a box, no longer touched unless the record is reviewed. Yet its meaning remains. The bank card still points to the same question. The blazer still marks the same movement. The property still connects to the same disruption. The Spearfish case still rests on those connections. Connections can survive a long time when they are documented. That is why a person reading years later can reconstruct the path. You and I can sit in our quiet imagined room and understand the broad method. Even though the original work happened long ago, the file gives us enough to follow. It does not give us everything, and it should not. but it gives us the evidence that mattered. There is a comfort in knowing what the file can and cannot do. It can show how the case was solved. It can preserve names, dates, records, and outcomes. It can honor the seriousness of the work. It cannot restore Chester's life. It cannot fully capture family grief. It cannot hold every private memory. Knowing those limits helps us read with humility, and humility keeps the tone calm. The next page waits, and its waiting feels almost like a kindness. Nothing demands to be hurried. The Spearfish case has already endured the urgency of its first days, the formality of court, and the length of later years. Tonight it only asks us to keep turning pages softly, to keep the evidence in view, and to remember that every strange clue became meaningful because someone, somewhere, took the time to ask what it was trying to show. And so, the Spearfish case does not remain open in the way some old files do, waiting for a name that never came. It was solved, and the courts held Elijah Page, Briley Piper, and Darrell Hoadley responsible for Chester Poager's death, with convictions and sentences entered into the public record. That fact sits plainly in the file now, not as comfort, exactly, but as clarity, the kind that answers the legal question even while it cannot mend what was lost. The evidence has done all it can do. The bank card, the blazer, the belongings, the interviews and the court papers have each settled into their final place, no longer moving through urgent hands or bright courtrooms. You can imagine them resting in boxes and records now, quiet under labels and case numbers, while the town outside goes on with weather, traffic, porch lights, and ordinary evenings. The work is finished, but the human weight remains. For tonight, we can leave Chester's name with the care it deserves, not as a puzzle piece, not as a headline, but as a young man whose life mattered before any file existed, before any evidence was gathered, before anyone had to ask what the strange details meant. We have sat with the patient work, and now we can let it grow still, the way a lamplit room grows still when the last page is lowered. The file can rest where it is, and the questions that were answered can stay answered without needing anything more from you now. Let the paper lie flat, let the room soften, and let the quiet around Spearfish become only quiet again.